What is up, everybody? Welcome to a very special episode of the Hot Breach podcast. We are live from Ubisoft in Barcelona, Spain. Joining me, as always, is Rogue9 and Prodigio Pete.
Hola.
Fellas, how we doing? How's Spain treating you?
Awesome. Yeah, we've been here for a week now, and we've just been learning the ropes, seeing what the guys do with the balancing patches, and drinking a few cervezas as well in the evenings.
Yeah, it's been a good week, and I think we've hit the time of year really well. It's like it's good weather. It's not too hot, not too cold. We had a bit of a chance to see Barcelona as well, which was really great. And of course, yeah, an entire week, not just sort of getting to observe the work that goes into balancing, but actually being part of it. And that's one of the things that's been most exciting for me.
Yeah, absolutely. As Rogue mentioned, we've been here all week learning about the balancing process in Rainbow Six Siege. And we're going to talk about all that today. As far as, kind of what we're going to go over in the podcast, we're going to be talking mostly about balancing. And you're going to hear a lot of stuff. There's going to be some stuff that none of you have ever heard before that we reveal on this stream and that we go in depth with. It's going to be pretty exciting. And just as kind of a disclaimer right here in the beginning, I'll say we have talked about a lot of stuff this week as far as ideas and stuff like that. And we're going to try and bring as much as we can to you guys. But just keep in mind that we don't know for sure that any of this stuff is going to make it into the game. This is all, for the most part, just ideas and stuff like that. So as we go along here, you might hear some stuff. It doesn't necessarily mean it's going to come into the game or the test server or anything like that. It's just ideas that we've talked about throughout the week. As far as some of the specific stuff we're going to talk about, we're going to bring on a lot of the developer guests. So you'll hear from a lot of the experts when it comes to balancing within the game. You may have heard recently there's some big news with a Jackal rework. So you're going to be getting kind of a look behind the curtain into what all is going on with that Jackal work. So with that in mind, I mean, what else are we going to talk about? Anything that you guys wanted to add to this kind of intro part?
Yeah, that's pretty much it. I think the interesting part is going to be seeing how the process is informed, right? So what kicks off the idea of identifying issues that need to be fixed with the balancing, and then also the process that we've gone through here with the balancing sprint to see how that information is used to then make choices on who needs to be buffed or nerfed or changed in any way, and then how that goes forward. So yeah, that's going to be it.
Okay. Well, with that said, let's go ahead and bring on our first guest. We're going to bring on lead game designer JB, as well as Tony, who's a designer here at the Barcelona studio. What's up, guys?
Hello.
What's up? Hey.
Thanks for joining us. Just to get us started here, JB, why don't you give us a little bit of the history of balancing in Rainbow Six Siege, how it's changed over time and what's different now compared to the way it used to be done?
Oh, that brings us way back. Something to keep in mind is that when the game released, lots of us already had the feeling that we would need to do that kind of stuff, that we would need to use data and make informed decisions as best as we could. But of course, we were big noobs at doing that. Ubisoft wasn't already a company that was super used to managing big live games like we wanted to do. Plus, we had this whole competitive aspect tied to it. So, to be fair, we were improvising a lot when we started. And a lot of it was relying on just hoping that game designers would spot the issues and find time to fix them, helped by different developers who could help them fix the issues. But we didn't have much processes in place to do that. So there was a lot of improvisation, I would say, during the first year. We still did tons of things, like we started doing the mid-season reinforcement at that time. There were definitely a lot of energy put into it, just not a lot of method yet. Then at some point, we ran into an issue that showed clearly that we had a problem of organization. I'm sure you guys remember the ELA issue.
Oh yeah.
Which wasn't that complicated to fix. It was mostly simple data changes, some of them a bit harder than others, but it wasn't that complicated. But still, it lasted much more than it should have. And it was clearly highlighting that because we were having this conflict of priorities and running between one thing and the other, we were not dedicating time to really look at it and fix it. So I started working a lot with some of the data guys that you will see today a bit later during the show. And the idea was to create a sort of dedicated team for the balancing. So we created a small team that we called the balancing team at that time. That was mainly me, Julien, and Geoffroy Mouret, who was a data analyst. And we started working, really focusing our attention on that. Things got better. Typically, we had a better reactivity. We created what is called the balancing sprint, which we run through together during this week. and we got a bit better. Like the reactivity was better. We had just more reactivity. It's just that we still had an issue where we observed that we were identifying more and more issues with time, and a lot of these issues were things that we could not easily fix just by having a parameter change, like just by switching a 5 to an 8, or just reducing the damage of a weapon. Or those things are usually fairly easy. Some others are not, and we run into another big problem, which you also all remember, which was Lion, which needed heavier reworks than just changing a few numbers. And the thing is, we did not have resources, production resources that were officially allocated to fixing balance issues. So that didn't mean that it never happened. It did happen, but because you have to plan a lot of things in advance in a big project like ours, it wasn't flexible enough. Like we couldn't find these resources as fast as we wanted. And so this is where we started having a good conversation with our Barcelona colleagues, because we had been working with those guys for a while. They had developed really cool generic gadgets like the claymores, the impact grenades,
Bulletproof camera as well.
And so they already had a pretty good understanding of the game. And so we identified that actually the place where maybe we could do that and have more production resources really dedicated to doing that all the time, and so improve on reactivity, was probably Barcelona. And this is where you guys came in and started working on this.
First big milestone was Lion, obviously. So that's around December, I think, last year when we started working on that Lion. So it was the very first balancing task that we had, but also we were starting to look into other issues like glass, for example. But since we were also working on the standard gadgets before, we were also working on the deployable shield that you have seen it reworked as well. So that's pretty much it. How the start of the balancing cell was done. So now it's 9 months, 10 months already, working on this, and it's great because we have a dedicated team here. It's not, as JB said before, just a team of 3 people just trying to tweak some data. No, it's a deeper reworks that require development. So that means that we sometimes need animation, new VFX, coding as well. So yeah, that's pretty much what we do.
I think that actually touches on something that I personally find quite interesting. I think you announced this during this year's Invitational, right? It's not just a growth in resources, but there's also the restructure now that everything is on a cell basis. You mentioned the balancing cell, which is like a cross-functional team that all works together on balancing, but very dedicated. And then you have other cells as well, operator cells that work on the operators. There's the watch cell as well that was announced.
Absolutely.
So that's interesting to see how, certainly from my perspective, having taken part in it now, how there's people from Montreal and Barcelona all coming together to sort of be able to work on this and cooperate quite well.
Absolutely.
That's a key part of the development process that we have, and I think we improved a lot since we started introducing these cells, as we call them, because it allows us to have a clearer owner of the topic, like balancing the operators, the watching of the
we've observed
so
progression on many topics. Having these cells is a big difference for us. Like it gives more ownership to people. Like people all know exactly what they're working on from A to Z, and it works a lot better.
It also allows us.
I was just going to say, so before, to talk about the cells a little bit. So before, you mentioned with Ella, I mentioned that as a kind of something in the past that's been a problem, and it was a problem for longer than before.
Yeah.
So before, you recognize Ella as a problem. It's not that complicated of a solution necessarily, and you didn't have necessarily anybody who would say, this is my job to fix this.
Exactly.
But now with the cells, you have a team that's their job, first of all, not only to recognize it, but also to fix it.
There's a clear owner now, which is the balancing cell, and the same happens with the rest of the topics, like the operators. But this helps us becoming better, more reactive, balancing the game, which is obviously a key aspect for a live competitive game as Rainbow Six Siege.
even down to an individual basis. You know, if you're looking at specific operators, there might be an individual person. You're the lead on this.
Oh yeah.
You will look at this, and then you will coordinate with other people, look at the data points, and then it all goes back through that person on a collaborative basis.
Yeah, even inside the balancing cell, we have 3 designers now, and each designer is kind of the owner of one specific topic. Could be an operator, or could be something more generic, like we did a change in the ballistic shields, because now you can melee with the ballistic shield, and the operator will fall into the BNO instead of being killed right away. So it can be not just operators, but something more generic. And there is a clear owner for that. It doesn't mean that it's a one-man decision. No, it's a team effort, but we need a clear owner that takes responsibility of what we do in the end.
So with you all being in Barcelona, JB, you're in Montreal. You know, what's that dynamic like? Do you guys? So you guys are here. You have what, 16 people, I believe, that are focused on balance here in Barcelona.
Yeah, more or less.
Okay. So do you guys like get so far doing something and then you send it to them, or is it like you guys are going back and forth the entire time?
I would say we go back and forth the entire time.
Yeah, pretty much.
Because it's a live game. It's constantly changing and evolving. The meta is always switching. So it's not something that we start just doing something on in our corner, you know, and then after a month we tell them. No, it's a
collaborative process.
Collaborative process, dynamic, back and forth. We have at least we have a weekly call, but we are in contact all the time.
Yeah, almost every day we have some kind of communication. The lucky part for us is that we trust them a lot. Like we've seen that they know the game super well. Like if you've just walked these floors during the day, you can see that they play the game all the time. They're super big fans of it. They watch your podcasts, like they watch Pro League. So we can trust them fully and just let them do what they do. They can take a lot of initiatives, and most of the time it goes super well. Of course, there will be sometimes some back and forth and some communication difficulties because we're very far away from each other. We're not on the same time schedule. So it can sometimes be complicated. Like anyone who's worked like that in collaborative processes across an ocean, no, it's not always easy, but it's a real pleasure because we can trust each other really easily.
You know, that's something I've noticed just walking around the floor here. It's not just a job for people here. They're playing the game all the time.
Yeah.
You just walk around, people are playing the game. It's lunch break. We're going to get into some ranked. It's. I mean, you sat down and played some with them.
We just did like an on-the-spot 10-man yesterday, and like the guys are like the players out there are good too. Like it was a highly competitive match. We were doing call-outs. It was a little confusing because some call-outs were in Spanish, and I was like, but it worked. And we all had fun. We really did. It's been amazing in that respect.
I think something that I find quite interesting, talking about the history and how balancing has developed, is the sophistication, the evolution of the sophistication in terms of identifying issues. Because you mentioned Lion and you mentioned Ella, and I think those were very clear once they were launched to anyone who started playing them, that they were very, very powerful operators right off the bat. And of course you can see all of that on Reddit and on Twitter, and obviously you as players yourself would have noticed that. And that, I believe, like from conversations we've had throughout the week, is how you used to identify issues, partially obviously just relying on your own experience in the game, and then also monitoring social media channels and feedback from players. And while that is obviously something that does help to identify sort of massive issues, I think nowadays the approach you have is far more sophisticated in actually identifying things that you might not notice on a day-to-day basis while playing, right?
Yeah, for sure. For sure. When the game released, we already had a quantitative approach to most of the things we were doing. We were already having this mix of personal experience and of course like feedbacks from the community through various channels like be it Reddit, Twitter, with the help of all the community managers and developers that we have. But we already had a lot of data tracking, so we already have a quantitative approach to it. I think the way it got refined the most is more in which metrics we pay the more attention to and how we prioritize them. It's interesting the example you took with Ella and Lion because those are very well-known examples, and I think they already show a shift a bit in the approach that we had, because Ella, like you said, was a very clear power level issue, and it was a power level issue in pretty much any context. Whether it was in Pro League or whether it was in even normal ranked games or even in casual, we could see it being too powerful in every possible context. So in that kind of case, it's easy problem to identify because it's the exact same problem everywhere. So it's a kind of things that we can solve more easily and analyze more easily. Lion was a bit more complicated because he was clearly too powerful in Pro League, but he wasn't that powerful in ranked games. The truth is that most people, it required too much coordination to be used properly by most like not 5-stack coordinated people. And so what we were seeing in terms of pure power level statistic wasn't that alarming in normal ranked games, which doesn't say that there was no problem, right? The problem was still very there and very big, like it was. So we understood with that example and with many others that maybe we had to change a bit the way we tackled our priorities on balancing side, and typically pay maybe a bit more attention to the raw power level of the operator and a bit more to the perception of that operator and how it makes you feel to play him, play with him, and play against him.
I think what's kind of interesting that I'd like to get you to explain a little bit for the viewers, because we actually took part in this week, is what's called the balancing sprint. That's really what we've done this week. And I'll talk a little bit, and I'm sure you guys want to as well, as far as our experiences with what the balancing sprint is. But basically this week we have taken part in a lot of processes designed to look at maybe balance issues within the game from a lot of different directions and talk about ideas for how to solve them. And it's not just, I don't know, like some people might envision like, hey, we get in a room like, man, I really don't like Legion. Think we could do something to fix him? No, it's like there's a lot that comes into it to first, like you said, identify the problem and then talk about possible solutions and how it will affect, not only the pros, but the ranked players, the casual players, console, PC. So much goes into it. But I guess the questions for you would be like, how long has the balancing sprint, like what we're participating in this week, how long has that been going on? Is this, what are the goals from the balancing sprint?
You want to talk about it a bit?
You started first with the balancing sprints, actually.
Yeah.
Talking about the origin of the balancing sprint.
Well,
perhaps?
the idea is that what we noticed was clearly that we were dealing with two different kinds of timelines. We were dealing sometimes with long-term stuff, like stuff that needed reworks, like Lion, or very often we were needed with things that could be dealt with in a much shorter amount of time. Things also that could be more urgent, where we had to do something very fast. So we were clearly dealing with these two things, and we were not properly organized for it. So the idea of this sprint is really to have a dedicated moment to identify the issues, and then have this sorting done between, okay, is this something that we can can deal with within the scope of this current sprint, so really short term. This week we tried to package it in a single week. Usually we do it in 2 weeks, but we're always talking about the next patch when we do something like that. So here we're talking about the 0.3 patch, the middle of season patch. And very often during these sprints, we also identify or repeat or keep on seeing a problem that has been identified as needing a rework. So something that's just more long term and that will require a more classic production development cycle.
So if something needs small tweaks, they can be done here if it's
Exactly.
numbers, but if it's a big change, then that might go over to Montreal and it might come here and it might be a collaborative process between the two studios.
Exactly.
Yeah, because a lot of times during this week, as you have seen, we just try to put all the data tweaks that we can have a build, so we can test it and see if there are any issues related with this. It can happen sometimes that if it's that at the beginning of the sprint we think it's going to fit, it needs to go into the backlog because of some things that happen in the way and we didn't consider at the beginning, but then we realize that it requires a deeper rework. So it goes into the backlog. It doesn't mean that we forget about it. It's just that we keep working on that, and potentially in the next patch we try to push that.
Yeah, we have to always measure the amount of risks that we're taking, because we already we don't want to introduce new bugs. Like we're trying to make just the player experience better. So if we just try to tweak something and we just introduce a new bug, it's not really achieving that. So we'll have to properly test things and make sure we're not making things worse.
Testing and analysing and challenging points of view.
Yeah,
Nothing
yeah.
is done sort of, ad hoc. Everything is really, that's something as a content creator that I've come away from this experience, seeing the amount of work and discussion and debate and that just goes into these maybe you're changing a damage on a weapon by a few points, but nothing is done. No one just says, oh, we should take X weapon and make it slightly more powerful. Oh yeah, that's great. There's so much challenge to.
Yeah, even though even that kind of things we test them, and if we really don't like it, let's say we change a recoil and all of a sudden it's too much of a recoil. So we will try to refine again the recoil and see if it can fit into the sprint. But if not, we just don't push it. We don't want to risk the game.
Yeah, it's been really cool to see how that works for you guys. One of the things that we're going to talk about throughout the course of this podcast are some of the changes that are coming very soon in patch notes. And then again, some are just wild ideas that were discussed. But one of the things that I was really impressed with was, like, we talked a little bit about Glad's fire rate. And we're in this room, we're talking about Glad's fire rate. We leave this room, we go on computers, and you guys have his fire rate adjusted. And we can just be like, oh, that feels like a bit much. Oh, that's a little bit better, yeah. So, like, for a lot of people watching this is like a dream world of things. I was really impressed with, like, some of the things that you guys can be like, oh, here's an idea. And to me, it seems like it would be something crazy for you to ever try and actually see in the game. And then you walk outside, and there you have, like, a rough version of it. And that's been really impressive to me. The other thing that, like, what Pete was saying, we took part in, like, a brainstorming session for an operator rework. Obviously, we can't talk about what operator that was, but it was a combination of really making sure that you nail down, like, identifying the problem and, talking about objectives that you want to get out of this rework and really making that aspect clear. And then, like, a brainstorming process for how you could possibly fix those problems. And everything was challenged, you know what I mean? Like, I even found myself, like, I threw an idea out and then I came around to it later and I was challenging my own ideas based off the feedback that I got from other people, and that was really cool to see.
You know what? There are ideas that went up on that whiteboard for that particular thing that we were discussing that I thought, that is brilliant. That is brilliant. And then you have sort of like 15 people discussing it afterwards. You're like, oh yeah, that is a problem. Things come up and are challenged and rigorously challenged, So you can put an idea on there, and you've got to, like, set aside your personal feelings, because people are going to say, that's not going to work for X reason. You haven't thought about this.
Very much so.
That's actually a very cool part of our dev team here, because as you have seen, all of them are super engaged into the game, so they can participate in these brainstorming sessions, and they can challenge all those ideas, and it's amazing to be in there.
Yeah, and they can bring also all this knowledge from having these different jobs. Like, if you have someone who comes from being a VFX artist and a programmer, like, there's tons of problems you're gonna be able to identify super early. Like, you're gonna be able to identify a potential, performance impossibility or some things that would hinder gameplay because a programmer has already worked on something super similar and already knows some issues. And, like, being able to identify tons of potential problems in advance like that, it just makes you gain tons of time. And so at the end of the day, everyone wins with something like that.
You mentioned earlier that obviously this sprint is all about the Year 4 Season 3.3 patch. And I'd actually like to get a little bit more specific, because there's a few great examples of what's coming out in the patch that we got to discuss and try out here. The big thing, of course, that was announced yesterday, I believe, is the rework to Jackal. So that's part of the sort of rework pipeline that takes a little bit longer. There's a little bit more effort that goes into it. And anyone who's seen that on Twitter by now, and I think we'll be able to show a little bit of it later, will see that is not just some number tweaking, that is a genuine rework. But then also the things that we only just sort of discussed and identified and then found solutions to this very week, like small changes that could be potentially coming to Twitch, or you mentioned Glaz earlier, Glaz looking at the fire rate, and just sort of, having the opportunity to identify hero operators that are either over or underperforming, over or underpicked, or that are banned too much or not banned at all, and then also more information on what do the players feel about these operators, and then use that to have this sort of list of operators to look at. Do you want to get a little bit specific about some of the changes we have played?
Yeah.
Like, okay, you mentioned Glaz. How about we talk about Twitch a bit as well?
Sure. Yeah.
That's an interesting one.
We played a version of Twitch where she had 5 less bullets in her mag, so that brought her bullet count down to 25, without one in the chamber, of course. Yeah, it was interesting. I didn't personally consider it like a game changer necessarily, but it was interesting. That's like one of the things I was mentioning in there, where it was like an idea, and the next thing you know, we're playing it, and that was really cool.
Yeah, you have the weapon, you have the gadget. It's why you pick the operator. We talk about the weapon, but you can sometimes do something to someone's weapon or their gadget, and you can look at an operator in a very different way. You can change the picture for why an operator is being picked. You know, Ash, for example, with the ACOG, and I think Twitch might be another one of those. We'll talk about data at some point, but that F2, as the data shows, and when we get Paul on, is just
it's
a beast.
I enjoy using it, actually.
Which is actually interesting with that tweak to the mag count, because it's a very high fire rate weapon. So lowering the mag count is significant. But again, I didn't necessarily feel it too much. But that's in a short play session. So
yeah, and also our objective isn't necessarily that you feel like it's a big nerf. It's more like we're playing on a relatively subtle thing where we just want to lower a bit the power level. She doesn't seem to be perceived as a frustrating operator to play against, at least not in the data that we're looking at. So we'll talk a bit more about that aspect later during the podcast. But our objective here is totally compatible with having this sort of small and subtle change, observe the data, and adjust in consequence.
Well, go ahead.
And it's not really the first change we've seen for Twitch either, because a few seasons ago there were already changes like, there was a big change where the reduction of the darts in her drones.
That was the F2 as well at some
recoil change last season, I believe.
Yeah, season 2 we had a recoil change to the F2, and that's just she is a very, very popular operator, and while there's nothing wrong with that, I think it does make sense to want to sort of make sure that all operators get a little bit of playtime. I mean, not necessarily in all contexts, because there are so many stakeholders to the game: console players, casual players, very competitive players, people who then go for go-fors, and then of course professionals who play at a very, very different level. And it's just finding that sort of opportunity where something doesn't break Pro League, but also still works for average people. And I think Twitch she's apart from Ash back in the day when she was the #1 go-to for anyone who was just solo queuing, anyone who just wanted to run a gun and be effective on their own, Twitch was always a strong second. So it makes sense to look at her, and I think it makes sense to still stay subtle on those changes. Because I mean, when we did play it, you mentioned the high fire rate and you've got to be a little more careful. For me, she still felt fun to play. I still had a really good time. I was still effective with the gun. You just need to be a little bit more careful with how much you pre-fire, how long you burst fire for.
It didn't feel like a Habana by any means.
No.
It still felt pretty well normal. And you mentioned at the beginning here, Rogue, that the Jackal rework, and again, a lot of the viewers probably heard about that. Can you guys give us like the big picture on the Jackal rework, as far as like when did that process start? How long has it been going on? And how long have you kind of known that this is the direction you were going with the Jackal rework?
As we will discuss later in the podcast, we are also using the what we call the surveys with the community that we do, and there we identify the frustration issues that we might have in the game. And Jackal has been identified as one of the frustrating operators, and he also has a very high burn rate, as you have seen. We wanted to act on that because we aim for having diversity into the game. So if an operator is always banned, it's not ideal for us. So that was the starting point for Jackal. After that, we started the following, the usual process that you have seen this week, to start discussing about options that we could do to rework Jackal. Not necessarily to nerf him, but to rework him, so it becomes less frustrating for the opposing side, because that is the issue that we are acting on right now.
Jackal has always been really interesting because for ages now, like we've had these balancing matrices come out every season now for well over a year, and he's always been underpicked and underpowered. And I remember sort of when we used to look at him back then, it was always the question like, well, what do you do with that? Does that actually even warrant a kind of buff? Do we need him to be stronger? Because I mean, if we look at sort of weapon loadout and gadget, the gadget, it is dependent on a little bit of teamwork. It does need effort and skill, and there is a risk to it because you have to scan, you're vulnerable, and you might need some cover from a teammate, and then even once you identify, you need to sort of get to that person and deal with them. But then the one thing that makes him very comfortable to play is very powerful guns. So nevertheless, it was always kind of underperforming. I think something that you've mentioned, obviously, the survey and where players get to express their feelings on whether something is fair or frustrating. But beyond that, what we've seen recently is the pick and ban coming into ranked, and that has changed the sort of the way that people also perceive it a lot, right?
Yeah.
Because there is almost like an influence, a circular influence. You see an operator getting banned all the time, and that's also suddenly when people start paying more attention. And because his pick rate used to be really low, but we'll see this later. We'll get into this in a bit more detail, and we'll get to show that on stream. Now that he's getting banned all the time, in the few rounds that he isn't banned, the few matches that he isn't banned, his pick rate has actually surged. So he's getting picked much more, and people started noticing the frustration of playing against the Jackal much more.
Yeah.
If he's available and you're not getting to play your favourite operator or someone that you miss playing, I've had people in games say, please don't ban Blitz. I really want to play him, you know? It's our ban phase.
Too bad.
Yeah, too bad.
Not going to happen. But this is actually kind of a great segue into the next kind of thing we're going to go over here, and really the next guest. Because if I'm at home right now, I'm probably wondering, okay, they've talked about Glaz, they've talked about Twitch, they've talked about Jackal. Why do any of those operators need a rework? And we've kind of done like big picture here. Let's start getting into more of the nitty gritty of why and what metrics you guys use to decide what operators need nerfed or buffed, and what operators could possibly use tweaked. So I think really to dig into the first aspect of the data that you guys use for operator balance, we're going to talk about what we call like the quantitative data. We're going to bring on Paul. He's a data scientist with Rainbow Six Siege at Ubisoft Montreal. Paul, what's up, man?
Hey, I'm fine, thank you.
Paul, why don't you just kind of give us a brief overview? What types of data do you look at, like hard data do you look at when it comes to balancing in Rainbow Six Siege?
A lot of data. So basically, we observe a lot of things that the players do within the game. So when they pick an operator, which weapon do they use, how many kills do they get, how do they use their gadgets, things like that. So we have some generic reporting, so like the balancing matrix that we've already shared with the community. So it's stuff like, how many times are you going to make your team win when you're there compared to the average like attack or defense win rate. So that's one of the things we were looking at a lot. We're also looking at, the pick rate. Are operators interesting? We look at weapons data. Are they too effective? Not effective enough? Are they interesting? Is the pick rate kind of balanced or not, or is there a clear better weapon or more interesting weapon than the other? And then we have a lot of more custom things that we look at. So it's not necessarily a regular report that we do, but when we investigate, for instance, we were talking about Jackal, we made some changes recently about the amount of the duration of the ping. And so we could still look at the specific tracking of the pings and see, now that we've done this, is more lethal. It does use it more per round, but which is normal because they last shorter amount of time, so he's going to use them more, but he's going to kill less people based on that. So we can do pretty much a lot of things
You're the go-to man when it comes to data. At your fingertips, you can see the big picture and the little picture of everything that's going on in the game, and put it on a handy little chart for us.
To a certain amount, I would say that I know a lot of what we can get and what we can interpret, because unfortunately we cannot interpret everything. We can tell what people do, but it doesn't necessarily means we understand why they do it.
Why, yeah.
So, which is a pretty important question, because, like, yeah, we're gonna talk about the frustration afterwards, but the win delta that we share is not everything. It used to be everything we were looking at when talking about nerfing people, characters, but the power level is not the only thing. The facts of them winning more or less is not everything that comes into account when balancing operators.
And that's actually, I mean, intuitively, that kind of makes sense. Like, I can understand why in the past you would have looked at performance, operator performance, and gone, that's what counts, right? If an operator is overpowered and winning too much, then we need to pare him back a bit, or her, and vice versa. We just need to make sure that all of the operators are equally useful in the game, and that's all you need to balance the game. Off the top of your head, that's what you might assume, but
It's really convenient for math people to like, this is pretty balanced on the zero everywhere. I love it.
If that was the case, we'd still be buffing Blitz and not nerfing him.
And that's a perfect example, because you have these operators that are clearly underpicked, underpowered, and that yet once you make them a little bit stronger, like Blitz, and I think that was maybe one of the examples in the past where the community wanted Blitz buffed. I still remember everyone was talking about, hey, hashtag buff Blitz, let's get Blitz to a point where he's useful and fun to use. And then once you go ahead and do that, all of a sudden it's like, oh.
We've created a monster here.
Can we change our mind, please? Yeah. So it's a very good starting point. But obviously, yes, we'll get to what's more in there. I think something that's good, something that maybe most people know by now is the Matrix, right? That's released all the time. Let's maybe see if we can get those up on screen, because we have the ones for the current season, and these are live. So this was data from yesterday, but it's still changing as the season continues. It looks a little bit different, I think, than people will be used to.
Yes.
Because what you normally release every season is a snapshot, so just for that one season. This data we have this season and also the last season.
So it shows the travel. It shows the travel between seasons.
Yeah, exactly. So it's pretty interesting because we want to see what impact we have on the game. So we want to see that, okay, we put a big nerf on shields. What happened to them? And so we can see, if we look at the attack matrix, that so Montagne on the blue on the left, like, he got a pretty significant hit.
Can we get an F in the chat for Montaigne and Blitz, please? Because oh my goodness, what happened to them?
So they became less. They became weaker. They went down in the win delta, and also became less interesting for people to play. So their presence is less important.
Yeah, so maybe in case you haven't seen this before, you've not really interacted with the Matrix, just a quick description. So what we saw there, basically the lines, they start on a thin end. That is the previous data, and then they go towards the thicker end. That's where it has moved to now. And of course, on the vertical axis, you have the win delta, which is basically the win rate with an operator on the team minus the win rate without the operator on the team. Precisely. Correct? Yes. So it's a very decent starting point to get on. If you know this data from previous seasons, something that is changing going forward is that instead of the pick rate, we have a presence. So back in the past, when we didn't have pick and ban, you could just go with the pick rate to see how popular an operator was. Now we're going with presence. What's the difference?
It's a very good question. The difference is that, so now that you can ban operators, looking at the pick rate might give you a very small picture of what's actually going on. We had a lot of back and forth on how to measure the popularity of an operator, because in the end, that's what we want to show, is how popular they are. So we looked a lot at what was going on in other companies, video game companies, on that, and we decided to settle with I think the easiest one to understand, which is the pick rate when the operator is not banned. So we just only take the rounds or matches where the operators are available because they are not banned, and we check the pick rates on those matches and rounds.
One thing that I think is really cool looking at this and the way that it's, the way that you can see the movement is we mentioned obviously Blitz and Montaigne earlier. So if most people probably remember the recent nerf that came to the ADS speed of all shields, we can very clearly see how that has affected them. Now that's not 100%, there could be other factors involved as well. But if I was betting, I would say that ADS nerf has made people really not only pick them less, in both situations, but they're winning significantly less, particularly Montaigne. So it's really cool to kind of see that cause and effect, and then to look at this data and see, that you're having the intended effect.
Yep, and sometimes it also helps us spot things that we did not plan. Like for instance, we can see the Blackbeard is going up. And we're thinking like, oh, maybe we changed something in the animation, stuff like that. So we can actually like fix problems that we had not planned necessarily.
Sure. And sometimes player behavior, and we're gonna, obviously specialize on that down the road, but player behavior you can't predict either. It's what's kind of crazy about it.
Yeah. And it's a constant iterative process. If Montaigne sinks all the way, he will be revisited. If these things are,
or maybe people will play them differently because
absolutely, people learn and change and
exactly like
adapt.
Sometimes we need to wait a bit before acting on those. Like this is only like a couple of weeks of data, so sometimes it's not enough, especially for operators that are on the lower pick rate or on the higher pick rates too, because there's a lot of volatility in the data. So it doesn't mean that because they have a low win delta that they are bad. It just means we don't have enough data. But yeah, sometimes we need to wait a bit, and people get accustomed to this. Like when talking about Twitch, maybe the role we intend for her is more a utility operator rather than a fragging operator, which is not necessarily the case right now. So people need to adapt to this, and we need to give them some time to do so.
Let me ask you this: so you mentioned if you, and that's completely hypothetical, but maybe a goal down the road would be to increase the utility of Twitch and decrease the fragging capability. When you made changes like that in the past, do you typically see their win deltas go up? Like if let's say that you nerf a weapon. Yeah. How does that affect a win delta of an operator compared to nerfing their utility? Do you see much of a difference?
It can be, it depends on the change. Some have no effects. We would wait for effects, but there were none because that's not necessarily how the players play them. For instance, on the Kate change, we did reduce his magazine size for the shotgun at some point. And most players do not go like up until the end of the magazine, so never changed anything on their parts. It did change things for Pro League because they use a lot of the shotgun to remodel the sights. So some changes would have no effect, and for some of them, weapons and or utility would have an effect on. They would affect the win delta.
Sure. Do you want to take a little at the defenders, or are you guys still on the?
No.
Yeah, let's pull up the defenders here because there's some interesting stuff here as well.
Should we get this kicked off with this question?
Yeah, I think that's good. I do.
All right. So
Rook has been dethroned because you think back to this data that we've had for so long. It was always Rook, not only the number one best performing defender, but the number one best performing operator in the entire game. Really, was always Rook, but he's not anymore.
Rook MP5.
Yeah, there's been some nerfs to that. That's how I would explain it. Is MP5 nerf has had an effect.
For sure, we did see some effects with the MP5 for both Doc and Rook.
Before we get too deep into this, I wanted to put a bit of a challenge out there to the community. So we've been discussing this week. If we could just have the chart on screen, you will notice top left, Capcan Frost. Now, the pattern that you outlined to us was that every season, or whenever these two move, they move as a pair. So we're trying to like work out what's going on, why they always move up and down the chart as a pair. So sort of little challenge there to the community.
Yeah.
If you've got some ideas about that, leave that in the live chat.
Why are they so high, and why do they move together? That's really
Always,
yeah,
it's like
it's kind of crazy.
hand in hand.
And they can have some pretty significant change, like
Yeah.
moving from like 2 or 3% up and then down, and then up and then down. It's like we looked at a lot of different things, but we still haven't found the answer, comfortable answer.
If I think about, these are only theories, these are only ideas, there's no guarantee. There's like, that's one of the things, is you look at the data, and all you can do really is come up with potential theories that may or may not be true. If I think about this season, well, we've had a shield rework, so I'm assuming there are more shields being used this season than last season. And certainly we've got a dedicated shield operator, or placeable shield operator, that's joined with Goyo. And of course there's a very decent synergy when you're playing Goyo to also place a Capcan trap behind that. That's very effective when it doesn't get spotted, or if you can't clear out the shield. Those are maybe some ideas that might explain a little bit
this
of
season,
an
at
increase.
least.
For this season,
But
for
what
sure.
about past seasons?
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Weren't you able to look that up? You're able to look at that data. How often is Capcom being played right now with Goyo? And you were saying the correlation wasn't actually...
No, it's played. We did look at that precise data, and Goyo and Capcan they are not significantly played more than with other operators. Like
It's crazy. I
can't get
No
my head
ideas.
around it.
let me throw a different theory at you here. If we can get the chart up again. If you look at Jaeger over there, pick rate's gone up, win delta has gone down, and here's my theory. Everybody that used to play Doc and Spawn Peak with them, because of the MP5 nerf, is now playing Jaeger. They're still going the same Spawn Peak. They're not laying down utility, so that explains the win delta loss. And... yeah, I don't know. That's the best I got. I don't know, but that's a big drop for Jaeger. That kind of surprised me.
I'll go with that. I think, you've got people thinking the MP5's had enough. I'm going to pick up Jaeger. They're trying to play the same style as they were before, and that's why we're seeing him being picked more often, but being a little less successful.
And Doc did go down in pick rate, down in win delta as well, so it could be a possibility. I think this. Go ahead, Rod.
Yeah, one of the things that I just wanted to sort of highlight as well is that something we have seen over the years that we've had this information come out is that there is a general level of volatility in the data as well. Sometimes there are no changes, and still the operator performance can vary from one season to the next. Usually not a huge shift, but sometimes it's more of a gradual trend. So it's interesting to see how not always every change has an identifiable or even a necessary cause, but certainly an effect.
Yeah, and I think that, again, most people are familiar with seeing this win delta, not necessarily in this form, but it's only a snapshot of the total amount of data that you have at your disposal. Let's move on to defender and attacker ban rates. If we can get that.
Exactly. One other thing is also like a very frequent question that comes up with these charts that are released is, why is it only PC players and why is it only sort of the top diamond and platinum? And the thing is, like, you have all the data for anything. You can look at PS4, you can look at Xbox, you can look at any kind of rank that you want, and occasionally you do, but you focus on the high levels on PC.
yeah, because we can look at the data. We sometimes do. When talking about the meta, we found that looking at PC players at a higher level gives us a better understanding of what the operator is able to do in itself, and not people that don't understand really the game and just pick an operator, and so like a random operator and just run around and guns. So that doesn't give us a lot of information on the real issues we can have with an operator, like is it linked to his loadout, to his gadgets and all. since they use way more all of the kit, the full kit of the operator, it gives us a better idea of it. And also, we find that people look a lot at so not about higher level players like in ranked, but at Pro League, they would look at Pro League and follow the patterns. So when we talk about pick rates or playstyle, they often like, we release an operator, it's not played in Pro League, nobody's really picking it, and then it starts to be played in Pro League, and like people are maybe it's an interesting way of playing it. So yeah, getting that insight gives us like an advantage time-wise. Like we know better in advance.
Do you ever see huge differences? Are there any specific massive differences, or is it just that the data for lower levels, like you mentioned, because people aren't using the operators to their fullest potential, is just a bit more fuzzy?
Yeah, we do see differences. If we had looked at the balancing metrics on lower skill ranks, so we don't have it here, but we would see that it's way more packed. We won't have a Jaeger at 90% presence rates. It's like everyone would be between 20 and 50%, something like that. So
there's a lot more operators picked. I noticed that when you put the chart up, Jaeger was his presence was so much lower.
Yeah.
So
one of the things that like really blew my mind when we first started sitting down was that you had all that data at your disposal, and it's something that I've never seen before. So that was like one of the first questions I asked you, as far as like console versus PC. What do you see are the differences and stuff? And it really surprised me that between console and PC there aren't huge differences, and that obviously that does go into the console aspect does go into your thought process when you're going along with balancing. But for the most part, there aren't huge differences between the two when you look at the data, and that really surprised me.
the thing is, it can have the same the same rankings between consoles and PC. For instance, one operator can be strong in both, but the thing, since the numbers will not always be the same, aggregating all those data together would make it less clear, because they don't necessarily have the same win rates. If we look at weapon, it will not be the same kill death ratio, because it's
maybe a few more shotguns.
Yeah, especially. So it's not the same way aiming with a mouse and keyboard and with a controller. So we cannot aggregate all that data together, because we're gonna have issues depending on, did we have more console players playing that shotgun? That means it lowers it puts it higher, the KD ratio than PC. So we need to isolate each individual behavior, and platform is a different behavior in its own way.
Let's show something on the stream that has, to my knowledge, never been seen before, and let's show the Defender weapon stats. So what you're gonna see on the screen here are for the Defenders, and you're gonna see weapons listed on the left side, as well as what operators have those weapons. In the bottom, you'll see weapon pick rate, win ratio, KD ratio, and kills per round. How does this data go into what you do as far as balancing?
It comes up when we want to understand whether an operator is too strong. So when we need to know, is it related to their abilities, to their secondary gadgets, to their weapon. So that's one of the things we would look at. Twitch is pretty good. She does have 1.3.
Yeah, that's on the
kills per round,
attackers.
KD ratio or something like that.
Yeah, 1.13.
Yeah, it's pretty high.
Yeah.
KD. So it comes up in that way, and when we want to tweak some weapons, for instance, we would look at it to understand if they are lethal or not. So yeah, it gives us some more insight on the power level of that weapon in regards to other weapons, for instance. You can see the colors. They represent different weapon types. So the assault rifles, submachine guns, shotguns, things like that. So we could compare it, all the AR against another. We also look at it for the pick rate a lot, I would say, because it's not always the primary goal, but it's a bonus goal to have balanced weapon in terms of like interests, that people feel like they have actually a choice and it's not mandatory to take the R4C with an ACOG on Ash. So for instance, that change made it a bit more useful for the other gun.
G36C.
Yeah,
Do you look at it like that then? Say, I don't know, IQ, she's got 3, ARs, and you want there to be, with an operator, you want sort of a balance in how their weapons are being used in the game. Is that a consideration for you that you want?
Yeah, it is. Like I said, it's not the primary goal. Usually, we won't make big nerfs or big buffs to weapon just for that. But when we see that a weapon is way too strong and overpicked, like it's nice to understand that if we reduce it, we're
Spread a little love.
Yep. And that people have more agency on what they can do.
I think IQ is a really interesting example there. I kind of understand this and I'm agreed. So we need the attacker ones. That's probably the next slide there. But yeah, like seeing how a lot of players focus on the commando at an 86% pick rate, and then even above the 4% of the AUG is the G8. So people will prefer the machine gun compared to the AUG A2. That's surprising.
Well, we did have a change recently with Amaru coming up.
Yep.
We did add the angle grip on it.
Yep.
It's made a big difference. It really has.
Yeah, I mean personally, I really hate I prefer shorter ADS time, and so LMGs are usually not my go-to weapons. But now I'm reconsidering it.
The LMGs as a class have just over time gone from being really an inferior weapon class. They had very slow ADS time, slow reload time. They were just objectively worse than the rifles. And I think over time we've seen an improvement with various different buffs coming along. Then if we look at the data again, there's players like Nomad or operators like Nomad, where it's actually right off the bat really well balanced. That's really good to see.
Yes.
To kind of put this data into work for what we talked about earlier, we mentioned Twitch is receiving 5 less rounds in her mag. If you look at this chart, you see Twitch with the F2 has the highest KD with 1.13, and as well as the highest kills per round, which is 0.83. So when you look at that, does that scream nerf to you, or how do you decipher that data? And maybe even a question on top of that: which of those stats is more important to you? KD ratio with a weapon or kills per round with a weapon?
Good question. It really depends on what we want the operator to be. If we want the operator to be a fragger with low utility, then that wouldn't scream problem to me. The fact that Twitch has good utility and we maybe want her to be more focused on that, yeah, it does. It does tell us that the nerf could be related to her weapon. Both KD and kills per round are interesting. The way I see it is that KD is more influenced by the role of the operator. So yeah, KD is kills divided by the death, the amount of death. So the thing is, some operators, I would say like roamers, for instance, they will die within the round. Because they are very aggressive in their playstyle, and it's fine. It doesn't mean that their weapon is worse because they have a lower KD, and it's more important for them to have a higher kills per round, I would say, rather than not dying. It's not necessarily the best gameplay for a roamer. So yeah, the playstyle would influence KD. So that's why I prefer to look at kills per round, but we have both of them, so we can still see if there are some differences between them.
What else do you guys have for Paul?
We can talk a little bit about the ban rates, because that's not something that has ever been talked about. Like,
that's true.
I think
that's true.
Because obviously pick and ban is very new in online play. I think last season we did talk a little bit about when this information came out about the ban rates, but we didn't have any solid evidence to look at that. So here we have actually some data for the first time on what the actual ban rates are for this season. And yeah, let's maybe look at that. Do we want to start off defenders?
Yeah,
attackers?
defender. Sure, we'll start with the defenders.
Defenders. And here again we have Year 4 Season 2.3 and then Year 4 Season 3. So we see the change as well. Although there has been a change, although it's not been huge. There's basically just been a switch at the top. Mira now banned 75% of all matches, and Echo 70, whereas before Echo had been the more banned one.
Any theories behind that change? You know, like it's the Mirror one is not modest. I mean, it's a good 17%.
I mean, I feel personally Mira is really good on Canal, so maybe that could have something to do with it. I don't know. Well, we also changed the map pool and ranked this season as well. Maybe you know we lost some maps that Mira wasn't good on, and we gained some maps that Mira is really strong on. I don't know. That's the first thing that comes to mind for me.
I want like Mira as a whole, because like Mira to me is it's a challenge when there is a mirror window. When I'm droning out and I see, there's a mirror window now, I know that I might need to find a different angle of attack. I might need to either deal with that somehow or come in from a different side. But it's never one where I've felt like, this is now unfair, I don't have a chance against this now. It's never felt frustrating for me personally. Obviously we'll get to that in a bit more. But yeah, I'm surprised maybe from that aspect, because in the past when we've talked about bans, there's always the comfort ban, right? When you're playing online, you don't know your opponents, you might not even know your teammates. Who'd you ban? You ban the one that you want to play against least. And we'll maybe see that a little bit more on the attacker side. But Mira, that seems very specific and strategic.
Yeah, I agree.
Maybe that's partially just informed by people watching Pro League. People watch Pro League and they see Mira banned all the time and they think, hey, they know something I don't. So that's something I need to go with. Whether that's then a necessary choice for online play is maybe a different question.
It's a great sign for the community, in my opinion, that pick and ban is starting to come around to tactical bans instead of comfort bans primarily. That's definitely a good sign in my opinion.
I think one change that kind of highlights that as well is the difference in Clash bans this season versus last. Because, I mean, Clash, woefully underpowered, absolutely underpicked. She's a dreadful operator to play. But she's also not fun to play against when it's one-on-one or just you and you have to push towards her. There is a struggle. And that's why I can understand sort of the 24% that we had last season. But that's come down a bit.
Yeah,
it might feel like a wasted ban.
True.
You know, because you look at her presence or pick rate, just banning her might feel like, do you know what? No one's going to pick her. Yeah, if you go and look down there, her presence around 5%.
It is a wasted ban. I mean, that's like a fact when we look at those two combined.
And if you look at the win rates, then if you see your opponents playing a Clash, you should be celebrating, because statistically, they're making it easier for you to win.
Yeah. One thing I would like the viewers to pay attention to, because we're going to bring it back later in the episode, is you mentioned Clash as far as the ban rate. The fact that Valkyrie has a higher ban rate than Legion, I think, will be good conversation tools for a later discussion. And then obviously, Legion being there as well. Do you guys want to move over to the attackers, or anything else you want to talk about on the defender side?
I have one more general question, because obviously these are global ban rates. I think it could be really interesting to look at the ban rates, or to hear about you at least talk about ban rates per map, or maybe even ban rates per site, because I would assume you could see differences there.
Yes, we do. Depends on the operator. Some of them are situational. For instance, I would say Maverick, for instance, he's banned mostly like on Clubhouse. Like there are maps where they are banned. So we cannot really go in depth with the sites, because you do the ban per map and not per site. But we do see some operators with very situational bans. Some other, like Jackal, are banned pretty consistently across all maps of the pool. So it doesn't really come into account for them. But I think it's more interesting to see those situational bans. It means that people understand. I mean, people have a strategy on a specific map, and they understand that such an operator will go against this strategy, and they want to have more agency, and that's great news. So I would love to see us being able to reduce those operators that are banned on every maps and make it so that there are more situational bans.
And that's something that's only going to, get bigger. This idea of a tactical versus a comfort ban.
Maybe we need to give people some time. Like
Absolutely.
It's a fairly recent change, so we still see some pretty big movements in those.
I think
values.
what might be interesting data over a longer period of time is to see how that filters down the ranks. If you could, this is global, but if you could say gold, silver, and just see how that changes over time. Yeah.
It does change.
So do you see a difference there already in the sort of types of bans you will get, or what is probably suspected? The types of bans?
Absolutely. At higher level. So when I said it was global, I meant global across all maps. This data is only for Plat and Plus players, and so what we see is that it looks a lot like Pro League. But if you go at lower levels, you will see a lot of Blitz, a lot of Kavira, for instance. So operators that are, they don't have the same power level at higher ranks, but people don't know yet the strategies to counter them.
Do you know what as well, though? We were talking earlier about presence and how when you look at the presence at different levels to Plat and Diamond, you do see a big difference in which operators are being picked. At the higher levels, there are some operators that just get picked whenever they're available. At the lower ranks, there's a lot more variety. They're willing to try different operators and experience the whole game in a way.
Yeah, true. So you would see more of Kavira, for instance.
Yeah.
You will get more interrogated. So that's when you think like, maybe I can use the ban to counter that. So, which is not gonna happen a lot in high Plat games.
As we look at the attacker ban rates from year 4 season 2.3 up to year 4 season 3, Jackal jumped 10% from 62 to 72% as far as ban rate. We have been talking all podcast long about how there's a recent Jackal rework that's been announced, and we're gonna show it in depth towards the end of the podcast. By the way, you'll see exactly how it works with video, with one of the designers that was involved in actually designing it along the way. But take me through your aspect, looking at this data and how it's looked over time, and what was convincing to you. Hey, we need a Jackal rework.
So I wouldn't say that the ban rate was necessarily the reason why we reworked Jackal. It's more about the frustration.
Okay.
So we'll go deeper into that with Lainey about the frustration afterward. But what I could see here, like the change in the ban rate would, in my opinion, likely be due to Montagne being banned way less because it's been nerfed a lot. Because of the IDA's change, people are banning way less Montagne, and so they have to report the ban somewhere. So
that's a great point. And that's not something that I would have thought of, in all honesty. I didn't look at that and put that connection together.
Yeah, it's interesting how you improve the game by taking a really challenging and frustrating operator like Montagne or Shields in general, and so people go, oh yeah, we'll ban this less, but then it makes some other operators look much, much worse. Because everyone is suddenly banning Jackal.
It goes for both the balancing matrix, the ban rates, the frustration. When you do one modification somewhere, it affects everyone. Even if you didn't touch the operator, it's going to affect the meta, it's going to affect everything. It's a very intertwined game. So.
Well, you mentioned the frustration metrics, and I wanted to ask, is there a time whenever, and we're going to go into depth of that here in a minute, but is there a time whenever they come back at you with, hey, players are saying they don't like Jackal, but you're like, no, look, he's not a problem, I swear. Look, he's not,
They would come to me to say, is this backed up with the data? But it's fine to say, no, it's not backed up, but we care more about people's frustration than having the perfectly balanced game. So we are trying more to balance frustration rather than win deltas, I would say.
That's, I think, a really interesting shift. And I was talking earlier how intuitively you would think, like, as long as all the operators they perform the same, the game's fine, right? But that's not the case. And like, no matter who the stakeholder is, whether you just play once or twice a week in the evening, you play casual, whether you get a bit more serious in ranked, or a pro player, at the end of the day, Rainbow Six Siege is still a video game, and you want it to be fun, you want it to be enjoyable. And it's not just us, it is the pros whose job it is to play this game and to play this game at the highest level. They still want the game to be not frustrating, they still want the game to be not fair. So I think it makes complete and utter sense to start to gradually move away from just a purposeful and very focused balancing based on performance and maybe popularity, but also to look at what is it that players don't enjoy, because frustration is something you don't enjoy, right? What is it that makes this game harder to play for any player, no matter what the skill level? And let's look at that and let's make the game less frustrating and more enjoyable, even if it means that that you're changing an operator that is underpowered, that is underpicked, that is not as popular. You identify something that is worth looking at, I think.
Well, I think, yeah, that you're spot on right there. And we've mentioned the word frustration a ton this podcast. We now have the frustration expert joining us right now.
That's a cool job title, the frustration expert.
I don't know if that's a job title I want to have or not.
Joining us now is Lainey. She is a user researcher with Rainbow Six Siege out of Ubisoft, Montreal.
Yes.
And Lainey is in charge or handles the frustration aspect, identifying those aspects that Rogue just mentioned. So, Lainey, why don't you tell us first of all, I guess, how do you measure frustration?
So it's been kind of an ongoing process. So when we last year we sat down as kind of a user research team and realized that basing all of our decisions off of the balancing matrix was maybe not the best way to go. We wanted to bring in something else, and we were really interested in trying to look at the actual frustration. There was the blitz change. We wanted it, and then we realized maybe it wasn't a great idea. So we wanted to find a way where we could be a little bit more flexible in getting some more information directly about more kind of the perception of what's going on. We also now had the balancing team here, which meant we had more resources to actually act on this information. So we decided to get a little bit exploratory at first and figure out how do players talk about balancing? What terminology are they using? What types of things are causing frustration about operators? Do we see some consistency across shield operators? Do we see some consistency against specific gadget types or weapon types? And looking at just trying to get people's perception. And then as we started very, very broad, thousands of responses, and really trying to figure out, okay, what keywords do people use to discuss frustration and balancing and fairness, and really starting to hone in, okay, we can start asking these types of specific questions, and then we know that we'll get more information about how the ability feels frustrating to play against, or how the weapon feels more frustrating to play against.
So let's maybe quickly back that up and make sure that we clarify this fully. So the way you gather this information is you go directly to players and it's gathered via surveys, right?
Correct. Yep, so we do big community surveys once per season. So we'll actually be doing another one very soon. As soon as I get back, we'll be kicking off for this one. So we send out the survey. It's quite long. There's a lot of different pieces. Some of you may have seen it by now. And we really want to focus on which operators feel frustrating to play against. So you can choose your attackers, you can choose your defenders, and then you kind of have some open-ended discussion boxes to be able to say, this specific operator, their ability feels quite frustrating for me to play against, and this is why. So it's really getting that why that we can now bring together, and Paul and I can sit down together and say, okay, this is what players are saying, here's what they're doing, where are we getting discrepancies, and where do we need to start focusing our efforts with the team?
Should we get specific? Should
Well,
we start looking?
Let me ask one more
Okay.
general question. What kind of rules have you found so far in the research you've done with players? Like, have you seen trends with them saying, "I don't like this," and you can kind of predict, almost use that to predict in the future? Like, if an operator's under development, you see it, you can be like, "I don't think that's going to go well."
Yeah, we're definitely pushing towards having this kind of larger matrix. So we've been doing the survey for just over a year now. So we're starting to feel confident with some of the trends that we've been seeing. Shields don't feel great.
Yes. Good job, community. Keep it going.
So we're really starting to identify with that, though. We've been able to start understanding like what aspects of shields feel frustrating. Not just we all collectively don't like playing against shields. It's okay, when we're looking at Monty versus Blitz versus Clash, like what are the kind of the more specific things? And it does become a bit more specific when you look at the operators of saying like, okay, well obviously the flash on Blitz's shield feels a bit more frustrating than Monty turtling in a corner and you can't get around him to defuse. Like these types of things. And so what we've been working on, which we'll hopefully be able to develop out over the next year through the more community surveys, is getting this list of kind of more generalized topics that we can think about for operators in development in the future, and being able to kind of say, all right, we know now with pretty good certainty from the community that these types of things within an operator ability might be frustrating. What types of, when we're thinking about counters, what types of counters might feel frustrating? Which ones do we feel like are acceptable level of kind of difficulty versus frustration? And being able to help inform much farther down the road, not just kind of within just the balancing team. So looking more broadly.
Pete, did you have anything before we get into the...
I think just the importance of this frustration survey, just to really get because Rogue mentioned earlier about you might look at the win delta, and for someone, before I came here, I would look at stuff like that you were putting out and think, crikey, that operator really needs to be looked at. But to know that this is such an important part of everything that's done here, how much are people basically enjoying the game?
Yeah.
So an operator might not have the highest win ratio or the highest presence, but they can still be an extremely frustrating operator to come up against.
And that's been really kind of a nice collaboration with Paul and I, is that I can really send out the survey, we get a lot of responses, I kind of spend my time in isolation looking at all of that, and Paul gathers his information, and we can really come together and say, okay, here's my stuff, here's your stuff, and we can really start to look at, okay, what kind of similarities, what differences are there? But it's really helped become really a big part of how we think about balancing, is because, like you said, we don't just want it to be all about performance. We want people to be able to feel comfortable and enjoy it and have fun. And when things are frustrating beyond any intention, like it's not just that something's difficult, it's that it's actually really frustrating, it's just not enjoyable to play against. We want to make sure that we're able to act on that information. That's not the intention of having that kind of displeasurable experience. We want it to be fun.
I have one more general sort of topic to maybe look at. It's like, so who is it that you go to gather this information, and do you then control for experience that they have in the game or skill level?
Yeah, that's a great question. So because we want to try and have some consistency within what the work with Paul and his team are doing, we do try and look at the higher level of play. But we do gather data on all of the players, because we do obviously have the back end data to match it as well. So we'll send out the survey once per season to 50,000 players, and then once we get all of our responses back, then we start to look at the rank of the player, and we balance out the distribution curve of the survey that matches the population, so that we ensure that we're not completely balanced too heavily we have too many diamond players, because like we see that might potentially kind of sway people feel like maybe less frustrated about something because it's banned more, versus in lower level that it doesn't get banned as much, so it has different responses. So we do balance out for their rank, but then we're also really looking at whether or not they follow Pro League, because that also, like we know, does seem to have an effect. We also take a lot of consideration with the frustration survey, looking overall, so all skill levels. So looking at, is there a difference between players that are unranked so they're only playing casual or unranked as of this season. Is there a difference between the whole population of players from the survey versus the ones that are at higher levels? So I spend a lot of time looking at all of those different segments and seeing if there are differences between them and ensuring that we're highlighting those to the team so that they can make informed decisions about, if I make this change, it might become less frustrating for higher level players, but could that have a negative impact on lower level players? So we're really trying to balance that out when it comes to frustration, because we have all of those responses. We can be flexible.
So you don't just get on Twitter and say, okay, people don't seem to like this. Yeah, well, I think we'll do something about it.
Yeah, no, I mean, we spend a lot of time really taking into consideration, because if we make a change specifically for a higher level of play, if we have a lot of players that are at that end and they're really more representative in our sample, then that might skew kind of what we inform the decisions from the team. So we want to make sure that we're really taking everyone into consideration, and that if we're telling the design team, something's wrong here, if they act on that, it's not going to have a negative detriment to either higher level or lower level. We want to make sure we can establish a nice experience for as many people as possible.
I was going to say, I don't mean to increase your workload, but if that survey drops in your inbox, fill it out, because it makes a difference.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Like, if you guys see this from us, it's super helpful. Obviously, like, as you guys have seen, it's something that's extremely important to our team, and getting more and more responses only ensures that we have more and more kind of confidence in the results that we're seeing, and we can really act on those.
Unless you're an Ash main, then let it just go by. Don't worry about it, and we'll just
drops in their spam folder.
I don't know if you have this from memory off the top of your head, but like you've mentioned differences between different skill levels. Do you have an example of an operator where you saw quite different frustration levels, or maybe even different reasons being given?
I think so. One of the surprising things that we found more recently, when we really started to look at it, was that a lot of the reasons of the frustration didn't vary as much as I would have thought.
Okay.
We do see differences in which operators are more frustrating, but I think we now can know that when we're looking more globally, we don't need to necessarily segment them out as much when we look at the specific frustrations, because they're quite consistent. But we do see some minor differences when you look at maybe more casual players. We get Ash creeping up a bit more when we look at kind of lower, because
I'm exposed.
It's a bit more comfortable. So players are maybe a bit more comfortable with that operator specifically, and so sometimes we can see her kind of creeping up a little bit. But as of now, because we have some that are still a little bit more frustrating, Jackal, he's kind of leaning things over a bit more for all of the groups right now. But we hope that in the future, as we continue to balance out, that we'll maybe be able to have these kind of differences.
Well, are you guys ready to have another first on the podcast? We're gonna show something to the players here that they've never seen before. I mean, up until this point, I don't know how many players, probably not very many, were aware that frustration or anything as a whole was actually a thing that went into balancing. Let's go ahead and show the defender frustration score, okay? And why don't you explain to us what we're looking at when we look at this?
All right, so this one specifically, we've got two different patches here. So when we ask players what in the survey, they're able to indicate the most frustrating defender to play against. And then they're also asked to rank their operators that are most fair to play against. Paul very helpfully does some maths that I don't understand and gives me this lovely graph, which is amazing. So it's weighted based on what feels most frustrating and what feels most fair. So they kind of get an aggregate, what we would call frustration score. So we've got two different seasons. So we've got our we've got Phantom Sight and then Burnt Horizon. So we've got our kind of different lines there. Clear up over there on the left, you can see Clash. Clear up at the top. So this is on the left, our most frustrating, and then when we kind of go down over onto the right, this is where we get into operators that are kind of less frustrating, or what we would consider more fair to play against.
Would it be okay to pick you up on an example?
Yeah, absolutely.
I was going to start down here, because this for me is, we talk about Jaeger.
Yeah.
We talk about Jaeger all the time. He's so highly picked. yeah, he's not frustrating at all
Yeah.
to play against. So that shows the sort of data that's being considered, I guess.
Yeah, I think it's also when we think about when we were just looking at the win deltas, Jaeger's clear over there, almost off the edge of the chart. So that seems quite alarming for most people. Like, why aren't you doing something there? Well, sometimes we have to make a distinction. Is we're not just only making balancing decisions off of that chart. We're also now really heavily taking into consideration the frustration. As we saw on the chart, Jaeger is basically clear over onto the right of the most fair. So while we recognize that he may be quite powerful, he's not necessarily oppressive or frustrating as we can see with some of the others that might be more of a candidate for either balancing changes or more of a rework.
You know what that says to me, and maybe you can tell me if the responses validate this, but it says to me that people are less likely to view losing to skill by in a gunfight by Jaeger with a good gun and good mechanics. They're less frustrated by losing to skill than they are to losing to like an ability or like a
100%.
Okay.
It feels
Absolutely.
as though it's, because you can jump all the way back to Clash now,
Yes.
the other end of the chart, and that's exactly what you're saying.
Yep.
I could imagine that is a frustrating thing, and I can understand why people are saying that because it feels like it unevens the fight, like the question of fairness that we talk about.
Yeah, I think it's exactly like we were saying. It's when it comes down to it, and this is something that obviously we kind of all had this intuition that maybe this was the case, but with the frustration in the survey, this is something we've been able to confirm with the community over time, is really that what feels fair when you're going up against an operator, and if it's just raw gun skill, it hurts. But at the same time, like, you can feel a bit less frustrated by the fact that you weren't bested by an ability because you was just raw 1-to-1 gun skill. They outplayed me. Whereas if it's Clash and you come around the corner and there she is, well,
Taking away your movement.
yep, so now I'm taking damage, I'm slowing down, I can't back away, I can't really push. So you're kind of stuck in this, well, I have my gun, but I can't really do much about it now.
Yeah, unless you're playing certain operators. If you're playing, I don't know, Zofia or someone with hand grenades or maybe even flashes, then there's something you can do. But if you're not, you're 100% helpless. And I think Paul mentioned this keyword as well, and I think it applies just as much here, is agency. Because with Jaeger, if you drone, you can see those devices and you will know, I need to clear that out before throwing my grenades in, and it's if you throw it in without looking for it, it's your fault. It's you made a mistake. Other operators that tend to be more on the left of this chart, they are the ones that can do things to you where you might feel I didn't have a chance. There's nothing I could do.
I think you spoke to that exactly perfectly. I think it's that maybe it's late round. Maybe I had that utility, but now I don't. And that feels a bit frustrating. Obviously, you used it, whatever, that's fine. Like, you used it when you thought was going to be appropriate. But now I'm kind of left with the only thing that I have, which isn't able to do much for me. Whereas if I can just drone into a room, I spot the ADS, maybe I can call out to a teammate, they can run in, shoot it, and then we can kind of work together to use our utility to push in. So it's kind of an interesting balance between those two.
We mentioned earlier an example of this chart saving an operator from getting tweaked, and that was Jaeger. He may look like he needs something according to other data, but this chart kind of saves him in that respect. Let's mention the other way around. I would say Legion maybe is a good example of that. So Legion is somebody, when you look at the other data, it doesn't necessarily jump out at you, but we've had a lot of conversations about Legion this week. Again, nothing that is necessarily coming into the game anytime soon, but I think it's fair to say he's on everybody's radar here.
100%. And he has been for a while. He's been something he's been consistently frustrating when we've been doing the surveys. And because in this example, he hasn't really been much of a red flag on the win delta. We've tried to give a lot more consideration about what would be the possible things we want to consider changing about him. And are they things that we are capable of doing within a balancing sprint? And really ensuring that, what would be the top priority? How do we prioritize what we want to do with him? Because obviously when players are completing the survey, they indicate, you know, like, oh, well, his ability is what's most frustrating, and then they explain why. We're aggregating all of this data as well, and just being able to say, like, well, dealing with something that's invisible feels quite frustrating. I can't see the goo mines. If I'm pushing and I step on one, this feels frustrating. It's like, I didn't see it. I couldn't do anything about it. I'm not going to be walking in every doorway looking at the floor. That's something that feels frustrating. What about the qualities of the goo mine itself potentially could be frustrating? Is it the weapons? Because sometimes we can see there's not a red flag on the wind delta or the weapons stats, but in the survey, sometimes it's this kit feels too strong, this weapon is too strong. So we can start to see, okay, there's a perception mismatch here, and we need to start to see, okay, what potentially could players be perceiving as too strong that's not showing in the data. So Legion's been kind of an interesting one that we've been talking about for a long time. Obviously, we talked about him during the sprint, and there's possible things we're considering about bringing soon, just to be able to kind of deal with, all right, you know, invisibility feels frustrating. Sometimes the goo mines feel a bit frustrating of I'm taking a lot of damage, it's a lot of time. Sometimes I have to just push in, and I don't always have the ability to, you know, let my guard down, to bend down and pull it out, and then that's when Legion comes or somebody else comes around the corner and shoots me, and I'm kind of stuck.
I think anytime we've had Parker on the podcast, he makes a very strong argument for Legion just doing too many things. Like when that goo mine hits you, there's immediate damage, there's tick damage, there is a blood splatter effect on the screen, there's movement penalty, you can't plant, you've got poison on your screen that is distracting. There's just all of these different things, and then you can't see them. So I think that there's a lot of candidates of things that you can look at. Some easier and some maybe not so easy. Like you'd think changing the way that it does damage is an easy fix, and it is something that we tested this week. There's something that we got to have a go at, what was it, play test yesterday, I think, or maybe the day before, probably the day before actually, that we just tested. So, and this was your suggestion.
Oh boy.
Stitched up.
Here we go.
I meant that as a compliment. I meant that as a compliment. That wasn't supposed to be putting a bullseye on you. I'm sorry, I didn't think of that. I thought like, it was a really good idea.
I just want to put that on the record. I actually really liked the idea, and it played out really well.
There you go. Let's spread.
So I'll give you that. Do you want to go through that, or?
No, go ahead, Rogue.
It's just a really simple idea. Like one of the things that makes the goo mines more dangerous than they are anyway is the initial impact damage, because you can't see them, and then as soon as you step into them, you lose. What was it? Is it 10?
I think the initial burst is 8, isn't it? Is it 8 or 10?
It might be. Yeah, it's somewhere around there.
Somebody will correct us if we're wrong.
Usually, I don't have the time to actually look down and make sure what the damage is. But there's something you can't foresee usually a lot of the time, and it just instantly gets you. So a very simple, very quick idea, and obviously for a balancing sprint, that's the focus is what can we do, what can we change right now to make a short-term effect. Obviously there's ideas that are discussed that are longer term, like, well, obviously they're invisible, so what can we do to make them more visible or make them easier to spot in some way? And what are the knock-on effects of that? But that is then where that kind of idea goes out and becomes sort of part of the rework timeline rather than fitting in the sprint. But yeah, what if the initial tick damage is just 0, and then you don't have to worry. You stepping in one won't lower your health. You have a bit more agency as an attacker. You have the chance to sort of retreat and take it out, and sometimes even without taking much damage at all.
Yeah, that was the idea, and I think that's a really interesting insight into kind of what this week's been like for us, because that was literally the first day, wasn't it? We sat down, we had kind of our explain kind of the core concepts and everything, and once we got comfortable, it was kind of, hey, what kind of ideas do you guys have? And I was like, how much time you got? No, that was one that I did throw out, and really my thought process was, when we think about frustration, one of the most frustrating things to me is to be towards the end of a round, not have the opportunity to look at every door and clear these out for sure. Maybe you're at 5 health. You walk in, you know the last defender alive isn't Legion, by the way, and they're on the other side of the map. So as an attacker, you're like, okay, I can get this plan off, and maybe I can win this round. You hit a goo mine, it does enough damage to kill you instantly, round over. They just won. Legion could be dead at this point. That's really frustrating. So this change still would allow, as a Legion, you to get all that information as far as location and stuff like that. He's still a good shield counter, because if a Monte is standing in a doorway, you can throw the goo mine. It'll go off. It won't do damage initially, but it'll do that damage over time, which means Montaigne has to do something eventually, and hopefully it'll reduce frustration. So yeah, that's a good example, Rogue.
I think it's kind of nice that you were able to kind of be here for that and be able to give your own kind of personal insights, because that's sometimes what we have to do, is that we look at the survey, we see all of the different specific things that people are frustrated about, and obviously we're not going to be able to say, all right, we're going to fix all of these at once. That might not be realistic, because sometimes that might send him in a totally opposite direction. So it's, okay, what feels the most frustrating? What's something that potentially we can do within the balancing sprint, like Tony and JB were discussing? What types of variables can we look at to be able to be tweaked quite easily? Sometimes we need to consider more long-term solutions, but being able to say, okay, maybe if we made a change in this way to the ability or the timing or the damage, then that could be something that would evaluate, these things on the frustration survey, and then potentially, okay, well, the weapons are okay, so this maybe is our priority, and that's what we're going to look at.
I think if we want to stay with Legion a little bit and stay specific, one of the other things that is always brought up is that you have these little icons, and how they're basically, it's an alarm system, and you can use them not just to know exactly when to peek out and get a kill, but also like even to just blind fire a wall, because you know exactly when an attacker has stepped into exactly what position, even if you can't remember exactly where you placed them. And something that never even occurred to me that I found quite interesting is that was not an intended, not a designed effect. That was a side effect, because why are the icons there? It's when you place them as Legion, you can go and pick them up again if you wanted to, but if they're invisible, you can't find them. That is exactly what the icons are there for, but they've become much more than that, and they're being used out of context, because almost no one ever goes to pick them up again. That's
right.
Not the intention, and that's not how they're being used, and that again is something that then can only be looked at once you tackle the visibility.
And again, great insight into what this week has been like for us, because imagine, for the viewers, imagine being in a room with people who can answer pretty much every siege question you've ever had your entire life, okay? So, we were able to throw that out. Oh, what about the invisibility? And so he's like, yeah, well, here's the thing with that. And they're able to find, I mean, that's not saying it'll never happen, that's not saying it's impossible, but to get the full story. I mean, how enlightening has that been from this week's perspective? It's great.
And when it came to Legion, there was a lot of ideas thrown out there before. I think I said, considering all the things that Rogue's gone over, the intel, the movement speed, bloody, so much. I was like, well, does he need to do any damage? I mean, there is so much to that gadget anyway. There's the audio intel, there's so much. And then you quite rightly said, well, hang on, that's the counter to shields. So the knock-on effect of that would be you might see more Monty and Blitz. So, yeah, absolutely. There's a lot to sort of think through when it comes to some change that sparks into your mind. When you have like a group of people that are playing the game day in, day out, they're easily able to pick holes.
Let's give some. Go ahead.
Yeah, I know. I could spend ages literally going over each and every operator on here.
Yeah.
I want to pick out just a few more and maybe not go quite as much in depth, because we talked about Rook earlier, and for me always he's been the most powerful operator in the game. You look at the performance and in the charts, and again, like, he is literally just one step above Jaeger. He is perceived to be very, very fair, which is interesting as one of the most winning operators on defense.
And significantly below Doc, which is, his kind of, why would Rook be so far below Doc in frustration level? Well, player behavior, I would say.
It's sometimes we can't always understand, we're trying to figure out ourselves a lot of the times, like, why is this one seem, because in our minds we're like, well, yeah, obviously, like, if they're being played a lot more, they're going to be a lot stronger. If their weapons are a lot stronger, we should expect that there would be a bit more frustration there. But sometimes it's as easy as, that the utility is fairly straightforward to understand. Sometimes if there's something that there's an inability to be able to understand all the aspects of how the operator works. Sometimes this happens with Echo a lot. Players don't always understand how the yokai works. how the effect, how many shots does the yokai have, how many yokais are there, what do they look like, what is this effect, how do I get rid of it, how long does it last?
Run as fast as you can.
Yes, exactly. I have concluded that most people think this is what to do. So that also can contribute a little bit to the frustration if there are aspects of the ability that are a bit more complex that you may not encounter all the time. Rook is a bit more of a straightforward, puts the armor pack down, it is what it is. It's a fairly kind of clear just thing that they're able to interact with, and it's not something that is left up for a lot of interpretation. Obviously, there's some specifics of the Rook armor that some people may not be aware of, but it's something that players are not extremely frustrated by, so we're quite happy with where he's at the moment.
It's almost the perfect operator, really. It's very useful, very powerful, very useful at beginner levels, and yet not frustrating.
Yeah, that's
I think,
great.
like,
great
the
point.
counters are quite clear. Players understand that, if I'm going to get a headshot, I'm going to get a headshot. Like,
Right.
it's not something that's overly complex. It's pretty straightforward. So usually we see that those tend to be a bit more on the side of more fair if it's something like that.
Yeah, the one that jumps out to me here is Mira being in the middle. If you remember earlier, we looked at the ban rates. Mira highest ban rate, but as far as frustration, it's in the middle. That again is a good sign for me that people are banning tactically. You look at Valkyrie has a lower frustration score than what Legion does. Remember again, Valkyrie's ban rate was higher than Legion. Mm-hmm. So really encouraging signs here that bans are starting to be used for what I would consider to be the right reasons.
Yeah. And it's helpful for us too, because obviously now we have such a wide variety of different data points we can look at, whereas maybe if we were just looking at the ban rate, maybe Mira would start coming up in conversation a bit more for us of something that we maybe need to be concerned about. But when we look at a bit more with all of these kind of pieces together, we can say, okay, well, maybe it's not ideal that she's being banned all the time, but she's not frustrating, so we don't need to start thinking about reworking some aspect about her, or maybe we can just kind of keep a watchful eye on her, and as we make changes to other operators, we would expect that the frustration of others could potentially increase. So she's kind of on our watch list of saying, okay, as we kind of roll out some changes over the next kind of few months, maybe something we just want to make sure, and that's why we're able to look at the trends over time, because obviously we can see that sometimes things go up and they go back down, so that's kind of the natural progression of what we want to look at.
Do you guys want to move over to the attackers now and take a look at that?
We have to move on. So
We have loads of time. Can we talk about Clash just very briefly?
Sure.
Because Clash is so fascinating. She is can I say the most rubbish operator in the game? Can I say
statistically?
She's just terrible. She's not fun to play. You don't do well with her. She's hardly ever picked. She's banned a bit more. Yes, fair enough. And that kind of brings us towards this again. But so frustrating. An operator you barely get to see, maybe, especially if you're playing ranked and there are the bans. And an operator you barely get to see play well against you, and yet there is the frustration. So, yeah, what did you find with her?
I think the interesting thing there was this was really the point where it was, all right, we look at the win delta, we see something, and then we introduced our first frustration survey last year, got the results back. All right, guys, most frustrating Clash. We were all a bit confused by this for the reasons you just stated, is that the pick rate at the time was not even on the graph. It was so far down. The win delta, everything was just so low that by all accounts, she was being banned. So, I mean, when was she really being played was kind of like, okay. So we really started to think, all right, this is good. We're on the right track of looking at frustration. This really confirmed to us that we were really focusing on the things that were important and looking at, okay, what specific aspects of Clash. We talked a little bit about, coming around the corner and I'm getting shocked. I'm moving slowly. I'm taking damage. So even though it's not something that you're going to encounter in every single round, it stays with you. That frustration, it really continues to persist, and that's something that we want to ensure that we avoid. And so, obviously, there's maybe a bit more to Clash than just a balancing sprint change. We've made some adjustments, but she's definitely on the radar because it's something that is not necessarily calling out to us when we look at the balancing matrix, but is a big concern for us when we look at frustration.
Sure.
All right, I give up.
It's all so interesting. And again, it's stuff we've never seen before, so I don't blame you. Looking at the attackers, though, I mean, obviously, you have Jackal there at the top for current season, but last season it was Blitz.
Yep.
What happened there, you think?
So we did make some changes to the shields. So we had the ADS change for Blitz. So we can't fully say this was the thing, but obviously we were happy that Blitz, those two kind of swapped a bit. So
just to sort of highlight a bit of a pitfall, for this data we are looking at season 1.3 and then going to season 2, correct?
Correct.
So that is before the ADS change.
I worded that wrong.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah, so we have made some changes. Obviously, with their next survey that's coming soon, we'll be able to look again to confirm, okay, how does it feel? But this is a nice kind of way for us to look at, we're making these kind of small changes. Can we see things shifting? We can't obviously say for certain that change made everything better because we're making changes to other operators as well. But we're hopeful that helped contribute to maybe a slight kind of decrease in the frustration for Blitz.
Definitely seems like there's more volatility with the attackers as far as you see a lot more variance here in the two lines. That's kind of what jumps out to me. Along your lines with you talking about Rook, you got to throw Sledge in there. I mean, he doesn't have necessarily as high of a win delta, but
I'm going to say, I've pointed this out before when we've discussed the performance and the balancing matrix. Sledge is almost always right at the perfect position where you want him to be. In terms of the pick rate, he is exactly where he should be on average. And in terms of the performance, he is always like on that center line with a win delta of around 0. So neither winning too much, neither not winning enough. And now, actually, in this data, he is classed as the most fair operator to be perceived. So that's a real success for him to be just not only objectively fair, but also perceived to be fair.
And I think the interesting thing with him is that we've been trying to develop out, these classifications of what feels frustrating at more of an abstract level. And with Sledge, it's really looking at, well, what feels good about him?
Yeah.
And it's looking at kind of the opposite of saying, okay, so if I don't have clear counters, that's going to feel frustrating. If I don't understand how the ability works, that's going to feel frustrating. How risky does it feel how much risk do I have to put myself in to use my ability? Well, obviously with Sledge, he's quite close when he has to actually use his ability. So you can, as a defender, you can capitalize on that window of opportunity as he's coming through. It's easy to understand that he can open up soft walls. Don't stand right in front of a soft wall, and maybe you'll kind of reduce that kind of chance if you know that Sledge is around. So it's looking at what we can also classify and learn from these operators that feel fair as well.
One thing that we mentioned earlier was Legion, and how this chart isn't helping Legion as far as the nerf department goes. But I look at Twitch here. Twitch is I want to say 16th, if I'm counting that right, on as far as the frustration for attackers. Yeah. So that would say to me, do we need to do anything? Are you in that battle right now? Or are you trying to say that, hey, we don't necessarily need to do anything with Twitch?
No, I mean, it's not always it's never about just one thing. That's kind of the beauty of what we've really been trying to focus on for the last year, is not putting too much weight in one single bucket. So we do have to take into consideration that at times we might need to make a change to an operator that doesn't necessarily feel frustrating. And that's okay. We can be motivated to make those changes even if it's not leading to that. What we do want to make sure is that we're tracking after the change. So if we make a change and then suddenly her frustration spikes, then we need to evaluate, okay, did we make the right change? What's going on here? So obviously we had made what kind of drove the frustration survey coming into about was we made some changes to Blitz. He was underperforming. Everyone wanted to see some changes. We made that change. He became quite frustrating. So these are the types of things like, okay, so every time we have made that change, the next survey we do, I'm constantly looking at, okay, those specific operators that we made changes to, did they go down in frustration? Did they go up in frustration? Because after this patch goes live next in the next couple of weeks, we'll be able to look and see, okay, all right, let's look exactly at what's going on here a little bit down the road, because then we can maybe come back to the fact that suddenly the weapon feels too powerful or things like that. We can look at that. But I wouldn't necessarily say that I'm against these changes, because we can look at other metrics and see that she does have some power levels that are maybe a bit higher than we would desire in some cases. And that maybe that just because that doesn't feel frustrating doesn't mean that we shouldn't make that change.
Well, I definitely want to talk about Jackal, but are there any other attackers here that you wanted to?
Well, yeah, let's look at the top few. And then, apart from Jackal, there's 2 full shield operators and 1 quasi-shield operator.
Which you will, for Blitz and Montaigne, I mean, they're ones that, as time goes on, we're going to expect to see the frustration fall as the pick rate, really. With
exactly.
those.
I mean, this changed recently.
The presence is lower, so...
Yeah, this changed recently with the ADS time that has come in for this season. I think that's going to make a huge difference. Like when I look at the comments on my YouTube videos, a lot of people always ask me out, so what about the shields? It's people who like playing shields, who are now maybe a bit disappointed that the shields are no longer as oppressive. Is that fair to say? So I think we're going to see the converse happen as well. Like obviously the people who enjoy playing shields now have to start playing something else, but that is going to have a positive knock-on effect in terms of how people perceive to be played against.
We hope so. I mean, obviously there's still the clash situation. She's got a really low pick rate, but she's still very frustrating, so that kind of frustration carries over. But we would hope that as we're making these tweaks and as time goes on, then I would expect that they level out. It's not going to happen in one season, but we would expect to see that, as these small incremental changes, that over time, that the frustration should level out a bit, and that others will become obviously more frustrating.
And if I was going to make a prediction, and obviously if you do get this survey, don't listen to me, put in your own opinion there, but if I'm going to make a prediction as to what we're going to see next for Blackbeard, I'm going to predict an increase. I've had people come to me this season saying, hey, he feels stronger, something feels stronger about him, and we've also looked at, obviously earlier we looked at the quantitative data, and there is an increase in his performance.
Absolutely.
I would expect to see a knock-on effect there, and possibly people go, hey, this is no longer fun, I'm losing gunfights here.
We will see in a few weeks.
We shall see soon. I'll be excited to see that.
Okay, so Jackal,
Yes.
this is the big rework that we've been talking about throughout the show. What kind of input did you see from the frustration side that really led to this rework coming about?
So I think one of the big things we wanted to look at were the specific aspects of Jackal that were frustrating. So it was that, the number of pings felt very oppressive when you looked at, if you got kind of stacking your scans on one operator, that time, that's a big chunk of time in a round. And so we were able to make those kind of incremental changes first. That came out not too long ago. So that was really the first step of saying, okay, that was the number one thing, just feels too oppressive, too much time. So, okay, perfect. That's an easy change that we made in the balancing a little bit ago. When we're thinking more about the kind of broader rework, it was thinking about, okay, how can we look at how the scanning system works, how much time there is, what information does Jackal see, how is he able to interact with that information, and how, as a defender, potentially can I get maybe more information about what's going on, or I don't want to feel as punished for my kind of play style overall. So what can we do to help not lose the essence of what Jackal is and what he does, but potentially making some more tweaks to maybe giving him a bit less information, making him forced into having a choice about using the information that's given rather than just following one person the entire round.
That's really interesting, because when we show the Jackal rework here at the end, you're going to see that the changes really reflect what you said there. And if you think about looking at the win out there's nothing you can look at there that says we need to do this to Jackal. But with your surveys, you get like real
and the ban rates.
Yeah. You get. So
we can confirm that and seeing like, okay, maybe they are banning for comfort and frustration. Okay, well, what are the comments that we're seeing? And it's that I'm getting if I'm roaming and I get tracked. Every single one of those 3 tracks forget it.
Yeah.
There's nothing I can do. And he can just follow me around the whole time.
We, I don't know if we'll come onto it later, but we ran some tests with the new Jackal with regards to reinforcing and stuff and timing the, you know, the prep phase. Because that's one of the most frustrating things. You go off to do a hatch, you retreat back to the objective or some little hidey hole that you've devised for yourself, and then you spend, you know, a minute and a half later, and you've got the full tracking over your head that you've got to deal with.
So it's feeling a little bit less oppressive in that style, where it's not, you know, I can still feel free to play the game the way that I want, and I can still have those site setup strategies that are very important and that I want, without feeling like you are forced into playing one way. As soon as you know Jackal's there, it's like, oh, well, now I can't go reinforce that hatch, or I wish I hadn't have done that. It wasn't worth it.
You perhaps have to deal with 2 pings rather than all of the pings, you know. So
when you can know that, you know, when you think about, okay, I've been scanned, now you can kind of think a little bit about, all right, it's not just, all right, this is a death sentence. He knows exactly where I am. It's trying to be able to say, okay, he's still getting intel, but it's not game over for the person that's being scanned.
Do you guys have anything else for Lainey?
Nope, that's it.
Okay, thank you. And we've talked so far about, you know, the 2 big pillars when it comes to balancing. You know, you've got one with the actual quantity of data that Paul was an expert on. We have the frustration levels that Lainey explained very eloquently. We're now going to bring on what is, in essence, the 3rd pillar, and that is pro feedback. The pro players within Rainbow Six Siege have a huge impact on the balancing aspect of the game. And to talk about that with us is Julian. He's a user research project manager. Julian, what are the ways that you work with pros in order to get their feedback and help balance the game?
So we got a few different ways to interact with the pro community. Obviously, we look at how they perform during the matches, but one of the big pieces of that is what we call pro workshops, where we, around twice per season, we invite usually 10 player or like a mix of coach and player from Pro League, from all over the world, to join us either at the studio or Ubisoft Studio to play upcoming content and to test out balancing changes we want to do like way in advance, sometimes months before they come out. And that's a great way for us to see if we are in the right direction, to see if we are really addressing the issue we are trying to tackle, and obviously for future operators to make sure that, well, in a way, we remove problem from ourselves, right? Like by delivering a more balanced operator from the get-go, that means less balancing issue that to have to fix down the road. Another thing we do is something we've done this week is the balancing call. So it's like more a tactical way for us to get feedback real quick on upcoming changes. So it's very simple, like a Discord call where we talk with among the best players and coach of the planet on Rainbow Six, and we run our ideas through them, and they can give their input. So does not mean that we address everything they mention, but it's kind of a checkup on what we are thinking about, really.
We got to sit in on that pro call, and let me say that was really interesting. That was
Yeah.
really interesting how that was handled, and they challenged you with some of the suggestions of balance changes you put to them, and you challenged them with some of the ideas. And I'd like to come on to that a bit more in a second.
Let's do it.
But before that, you talk about the pro workshops. Are you able to give some specific examples of changes that pro players have said, perhaps when you've looked at an operator that we have in the game now, but in that sort of embryonic stage before they came in? Is there any positive things or any, you know, I suppose, for example, I'm leading you.
Yes, we have a few good, like I would say, success story with that.
Yeah.
One that stands out is Nomad, because during the development, the first iteration that we had, that you actually were able to play on the TTS initially, was for the air jab of Nomad to explode mid-air if they detected an opponent. Pretty much like Zofia's concussive grenade. And that was very fun to play. So internally,
I love it. Frankly,
that was internally when we tried it out, because we test a lot of things among ourselves first. And we really liked the idea. It was fun, and you still had this possibility to use it as she is used today, which is area denial and a trap for defender. But we like the idea of the mid-air explosion. And what happened is that during those pro workshops, we had consistent feedback that this aspect of the operator was maybe a bit too much. It allowed the pro players to really flush out any defender. We were seeing a lot of Mira getting knocked out of behind her Mira before she could do anything, which allow you, for example, to plant or things like that. It allows you to, even without really droning, flush out a roamer. If you know that he's in an area, you just throw an air jab, and if it explodes mid-air, you're just pushing and you kill him. So that was a bit too strong, and we were really on the fence. Like with most of the design we have a lot of competing ideas, and we like both versions. Like one was a bit more like wonky and fun and strong, and the other was more like conservative, and it's just an area denial. So we actually prototyped both, and we went along with both for a long period of time. And what we put on the test server was the cool part, I would say. We knew that there was a chance that people will react to that, saying, all right, it's fun, but it's too strong. And I think it's a healthy process to say, all right, we know that this might happen, so we have a backup Nomad in our pocket, and we put her on the test server, and we got a feedback from the community at large saying, all right, that might be too strong. So we swapped this version for the one you can currently play, which is the one where it's just a reactive trap rather than something like you can use very actively.
Before we look at maybe some of the more specific things that we saw this week during the call, there's one more general thing I'd like to address, because I think in sort of the public opinion, there's a lot of misconceptions around this. Yes. When I hear about pro workshops or pro influence on the game in public, there's two opinions. There's people who are really worried and think, oh my God, they're making the game only for the pros, and it's going to be worse for me, and it's going to be less fun. And then sometimes you see pro players complaining publicly as well. Hey, we gave this feedback, nothing's happening, they're not listening to us. So you have almost the worst of both worlds, right? Yeah. You have the general player base who doesn't appreciate the fact that you listen to pros, and then you have the pros who don't feel listened to. Yes. So for me, having an insight here a little bit, I think it was good to see that it's not nearly as bad as I think both groups seem to think.
Yeah, we have that competing idea for a long while now of pro complaining that we listen to Reddit too much, and Reddit complaining that we listen to pro too much. It's actually a balancing act, really, because so there is a few things going on. Sometimes they have different issues, which means that we need to focus on one or the other group to get an idea of what's going on. We have some operators that perform very well in Pro League and not so well in ranked in general, or like more averagely, I would say. Lion was an example of that. There are other operators that are very, team-based, coordination-based.
Castle. Yeah.
Castle is a counter example of an operator. Like he's very useful in Pro League. Not dominant, but good. So we need to balance both, and also they don't really have always the same interest in mind. Like most people want to have a fun games to enjoy. For the pros, it's their high livelihood, so they are more like they might be a bit more serious about it, which means that sometimes they are more conservative on content that we show them, and it's really relied on our expertise that we accumulated over the past few years, like of working with them and working with the community. This really informs our how we balance both. We tend to have trying to balance both feedback and maybe go for the middle ground in most cases to say, all right, they think it is too strong, we are afraid it might be too weak, so let's see where we can fit, and Nomad is a good example of that.
You mentioned Nomad as a positive change, so I've got to ask now. Is there one that comes to mind that maybe that you feel like the pros gave their feedback and it resulted in maybe a less desired state for an operator upon release?
Yes, for sure. It is very hard for us to know how. Like I like to say that we have these sayings of they are not always right, but they are right more often than most people. Which means that it's hard for us sometimes to challenge it, even though we have a bit of experience doing that. And cases where maybe we went too conservative about it was the recent operators, Warden. Warden and Nuke, I think, both had kind of the same issue where they showed fairly strongly in our internal pro workshop. Some of it is by design. I would say like Warden is by essence a very situational operator. We don't expect him to be ever dominant, but it ended up being more situational than what we thought it would be. But in the context of the pro player, especially back when we first started working on Warden, where smoke plants were fairly dominant as a strategy, which is not the case anymore. They were afraid of that. Like having an operator that can completely shut off a plant was scary, and understandably so. Like we saw them, like literally saw them making very impressive play with that operator. So we tried to tone him a bit, like maybe having a loadout that is a bit weaker, such as a very average gun and stuff like that, one speed. So this all came to play like that. And right now we are looking at maybe doing the other way around, because he is very much underplayed and also underpowered based on the data we have. He is not exactly dominant in Pro League. It's mostly due to metagame change. Like we don't see smoke as much as we used to. We don't have the infamous like terrible 4 that we used to have, which is dominant Lion, Ying, Dokaibi, and Glass all coming together to push through smokes. So that's not really the game anymore. So we have to maybe revisit him a bit at some point and try to balance things out. And the other one would be Nuke, where it's more encouraging for us because we thought initially that she was in the same bucket as Warden, like underplayed and underpowered, but we are starting to see this trend almost reverse itself, especially since Pro League started with them. Because like keep in mind that they are playing the operator with one full season of difference, and that means that they only started playing her, and we are starting to see some interesting play. And when we were discussing this week a possible change is for Nuke, one of the feedback they gave us was maybe wait a bit because we have some cool stuff in our pocket with her. So we're gonna see how it plays out, but it's still on the table. Like really something like we're gonna keep an eye on.
They said in the pro call that we sat in on that she's being scrimmed. You know, this is an operator that's being scrimmed. Give us some time. We're going to see a little bit more from it. And as I forget who it was earlier, perhaps Paul was saying how it sometimes comes down from the pro league and then filters through to the wider community anyway. So that whole process does take a bit of time before you can make those decisions. That being said, Warden, I think we tested a few.
To be fair, he is always going to be situational. Like
yes,
it
of
is
course.
in his essence to counter a very specific strategy. But if the reason he is not played is just because smokes are not there, it's fine. But I feel like there are more than that right now. Even when there are smokes in play, it's not always easy to leverage. You don't have a great gun, maybe you're dead before you can actually use your ability. So we are going to keep an eye on him because he might need some love.
One of the things that I found quite amusing during the call that we had was you could really tell that the pros, they have an agenda. Like their job is to play the game, and so obviously any big changes, it's a threat to them. Well, I say threat. It means a lot more work because if there's anything that changes the meta significantly, you're going to have to just revise all of your strategies. You're going to have to reevaluate all of your opponents. There is a ton of work that goes into that, and of course it makes complete sense that that's something they're not obviously looking for. Some of the really funny things, and it almost made me laugh, was when you propose a change to them and say, hey, so there's this operator that's underpicked and is kind of underperforming, and we're thinking about trying to bring this up a little bit by making a change XYZ. And they go like, yeah, no, we're not a fan of that. How about, and they propose an opposite change, which is actually they don't nerf.
We want to buff this operator. We don't want to nerf
Can
them.
we please make this operator stronger? Well, how about you make him weaker, actually? So it was funny. And of course, that's something that you then have to also take into account when you evaluate that feedback.
And it's totally understandable, right?
Yeah.
Like, they have their own goals, as you say. Yeah. They scrim and they practice these strategies, so they come at it from that point of view, and it's your job, I guess, to really take into account what they say. If they say that, you know, we're going to see Nook in the future, well, let's see, you know, and then we can come back on the next pro call and say, yeah, we're seeing a bit more, or we're still not seeing, and then you can obviously hold them to account on that.
Let me paint the picture for this call a little bit, because this took place on what was it, Wednesday?
Possibly
It may have been,
Tuesday.
yeah. But either way, we had been working with people here in Barcelona for a while. We had developed ideas. I'll give the Legion idea as an example, and we can go through and list some of the things that we mentioned in the call. But we talked about the Legion idea. We worked it out as a group. We talked pros and cons. We said, okay, I think after this process, I think this is something that we want to move forward with. So we get on the pro call, the next day, and you presented that to them, and their feedback on the Legion specific example was, they were fine with it. Some of the other things that we talked about, not so much. We had discussed some things with Kaid, and they were really hesitant to do anything to Kaid. Actually, it was what you talked about. Hey guys, we're thinking about doing this with Kaid, and they're like, well, how about you nerf his shotgun instead?
Oh, that's the bargaining was really good. Like, hey, we want to do something to the weapon of this operator. It's like, we don't really like that. But you can do it if you do something else to someone else, and that's like, no, this is not a negotiation. You don't get to sort of ask for other changes. But it was funny to see that tried on anyway.
But they are human beings, right?
Oh.
But they are also very helpful, and I want to give them credit because they spend time, which is valuable. Their time is very valuable to help us. It's an ongoing informal conversation, so sometimes there is a bit of back and forth. But overall, I think their input really helps the game improve in the right direction.
Absolutely, and even those alternative suggestions that are off topic and come in as a sort of bargaining chip, those might be good ideas anyway.
Yeah, and I think, just in general, when we talk about the changes that have happened to balance throughout this entire podcast over time, I mean, it's very easy to say that balancing has improved in this game. And I think the process that we're outlining here is a huge part of that. And the pro feedback is a pillar of this process. So there's no way you can talk about balance improving without saying that the pros have been a big part of that.
Yes, and they also, it's harder for everyone to see it, but the work, like the feedback they give before the operator is released, really avoid a lot of balancing issues. So it's like even an issue we don't have to fix later. So that's really a key part of what we are doing.
I don't know if you want to talk about some of the specifics with some of the items.
We mentioned Legion, we mentioned Kaid. What else do you got?
What was the specifics with Kaid?
So a change. Obviously, this is something that's being considered. This is not necessarily coming in the next
final.
patch. Yeah, exactly. But with Kaid, there was the idea of increasing the radius, the area of effect of his electric claws, so that you can basically electrify 3 regular walls next to each other if you're pretty central. And yeah, I mean,
I found it made a big difference on a garage.
We played it, and it makes it more comfortable to play. It gives you more of an opportunity to do stuff like, you mentioned garage. The way he's right now, you need to use both of your electric claws, and that's it. You're done.
And it might be consulate. You might have a hatch. You know, you might have other bits and pieces to do. So that's one of the ones that we tested. Not a final thing that necessarily come into the game, but
and it felt fine in the practical test that we did. But obviously, the pros had very valid concerns, I think. So there's basically 2 concerns that they had, was that if the range is too large, there could be certain situations where you could place a claw behind a solid wall. For instance, I think they mentioned the room next to church.
Church and memorial hatch.
Exactly, the memorial hatch. You could electrify that potentially, from within church, and your claw would be 100% safe there. Now that's something that we can easily then go away and test, and obviously the developers will do that. And if that is a thing, then that is a very valid concern. If it's not a thing, then it's certainly a good idea to check for. And I think the other idea was tricking, if you can trick 3 walls at once. Again, I think it is a valid concern. For me personally, like when we were playing it, it didn't feel too bad. It still has the very slow deploy time. It takes a long time to get that up. So there are ways to counter it still. And I think it brings Kaid more on par with Bandit, because Bandit has more batteries, has more flexibility. Like, yes, you have the claw that is slower to deploy, but then you can get all 3 at once. I like that as something that is more new player friendly, something that's more friendly for lower skill players. But obviously, yeah, there's more testing that would go into that to make that decision.
And keep in mind that at their level, their experience of that kind of mechanic is a bit different. Like missing a trick in Pro League can have drastic impact, whereas in ranked maybe it is what it is. They are very good at handling timings in general. So like change to anything that touch to breach are always a bit tricky at the Pro League level because it can have fairly big impact to how the game plays out at the highest level.
And that conversation with Kaid was a perfect example of how complex balancing this is, because one of their exact comments was this will make Kaid a better bandit. Because they're at the high skill level. That shotgun for them is an amazing weapon. Like a lot of them say it's the best defender weapon in the game right now. For the lower skill player, it's a semi-auto shotgun that has good destruction, but you're not landing as many of your bullets. That could be a potential problem. So, yeah, I mean, that's not necessarily. I don't think that most lower skill players would say that Kaid is a better bandit. I think that they'd rather bring bandit almost 100% of the time. So that definitely was an eye-opening experience for me.
I think there's one more thing that we can point out. Obviously, we've talked about the pro workshops and the pro calls you do, but I think it's also worth highlighting that there is much more that you do. You don't just have workshops with pros, you have workshops with regular Siege players, you have workshops with players who might not even play Siege. You bring people in to sort of get their experience and their input on potential changes or changes that have already been prototyped to see how is the general perception. And then, of course, something that is, I think, that was actually quite eye-opening for me is that every day you have at least one formal play session with developers where you bring in different developers with different disciplines to try out changes before they're put into the game. So I think maybe we've been talking about the pro scene quite a lot. To maybe avoid the misconception here that they're listening just to the pros again, you talk to a lot of other people as well.
Well, we discussed the survey earlier, which is one way for us to get feedback from the community at large. But we test content in-house a lot with a lot of different players. You mentioned the daily play session, which are usually for us to fine-tune and iterate on upcoming content, and we have a lot of content, so there is a lot of play session, obviously, which is a great tool for us to like maybe, for example, you have an operator, it goes into a pro workshop, we get feedback, we address those feedback, and then we test it internally to see if did we fix the issue we wanted to fix? Is it still interesting, even if, for example, we diminish the power level of something? So that's a great tool for us. And there also, we have the means to bring external player of any level almost, which is something we always do for upcoming content, because we want to make sure that everything is easy to play, understandable, interesting, and fun at all level. So there are people that come at the Montreal studio that are, I don't know, silver, gold, copper, I don't know, and test the upcoming operators. So everyone is involved one way or another.
Really interesting that there's that much. I mean, it sounds like a really cool place to work. Huh? Like, hey, when we get back from lunch, how about we play a little bit on some new Siege content?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
it's amazing. Exactly.
And then you all get together at the end and talk it through.
Very much like what you guys experienced this week was a good example of that. We had a cool idea which we tested internally, then we got together to debrief the issue, and we're gonna look at those feedback and iterate and test again. And I think that's how you do good design in general.
Yeah, it was really interesting because we took part in several of them, and it is formal. There is a briefing beforehand. Yes. This is what's different. This is what is different from the regular game. This is what specifically we're looking at, and then you just get to play and test that for an hour or two, and then everyone comes together and then provides exact feedback with detailed questions that are asked. How did you use this specific change to this operator? How did it feel? Too powerful? Not powerful enough? How would you see it different? And it's just the information that comes out, something like that, just every day is very powerful, I think.
Well, it's fun, but it's still a job, so there is a lot of method going into it.
Yeah. And I just want the record to state that Rogue was playing BB in these play sessions. There were no changes to BB, mind you, okay? But he still chose to play Blackbeard in a play session.
It's the try-hard.
I mean, just so, if that doesn't scream try-hard.
I don't normally play Blackbeard, and when I do, I don't play him well. But did you see these performance graphs? He's been doing well this season. So I was like, I'm playing Blackbeard.
Statistical choices with your operator picks.
I did well.
I'd like to ask about how the pros have responded to the Jackal.
Yeah,
What
that's
feedback-
let's move on to that.
Yeah,
What feedback they've given you, what their thought process has been.
So Jackal was an interesting example for us because I think they had the Jackal issue earlier than everyone else, because before we got into seeing those crazy high presence rate due to the ban system, they were already playing Jackal quite a lot, and they were already mentioning that Jackal was fairly dominant. But I think what happened is that we had Lion overshadowing Jackal in general for quite a long time, and it was banned in Pro League. So like they had to make up for the tools. And now that Lion is not as much on everyone's radar, I think Jackal is becoming dominant. But it started with them. So when we presented those changes to them, they were very happy with what we had in mind and what we are starting to show on the server. And what we discussed earlier about them being frustrated too sometimes, I don't think at any point Jackal was really overpowered even in Pro League, but he was already frustrating because it was kind of a reminiscence to what Lion could do, which at their level is very problematic, which is providing information on where a defender is without taking any risk almost. And at their level, they can act on this information very quickly and like very drastically. So they were as frustrated by Jackal as is everyone else. So when we started testing those changes a few months ago with them, they were very happy with it, and we were able to progress through the steps of actually making the changes and progressing with that.
So they were like, I'm good with these changes, just do it.
Yes,
Yeah, they were relieved.
Well, I think due to all the chats we had and the frustration survey, we were able to pinpoint quite well what were the things we needed to address, and they loved it.
I mean, on the pro call we were in, they were like, "When is he coming?"
Yeah,
They were keen.
They were excited.
They were keen as mustard.
Yeah, and I think you mentioning sort of ready to progress and actually make the changes, I think that's a pretty good segue.
The only just let me ask one more quick question here, because I'm just kind of curious about this. I think the viewers might be as well. You mentioned Jackal and Lion as far as being frustrating operators for the pros. Is there any other frustrating operators you can think out for them that maybe the average player isn't as frustrated by, or that they might be surprised frustrate the pros as much as they do?
Everything that gives information is fairly important for them. I would say Maestro is more an issue for them than it is for the general population. Obviously, he's very strong at all level of play, but I think they have an ability to leverage information a lot, very well. And the current combo Maestro Echo with other information operator means that they are sometimes a bit overwhelmed by the amount of information the defense have, and that gets a bit frustrating for them sometimes. This is why we are looking into all those operators to see how we can maybe tweak that a bit.
It was actually something that surprised me a little bit from the frustration data specifically, because Maestro he's pretty much bang on zero. He's not fair, or considered to be fair to an excess, but also not frustrating to an excess, which, considering how powerful he is, even at all levels, that was actually a little bit surprising to me.
It was, yeah. That's a good point.
But it's really good to highlight that there is the sort of dissonance between at least the perception there between the pros and the regular players.
Well, thank you, Julian. I really appreciate that insight. Keep up the good work, man. We're going to move on to the final guest segment that we have here. We've talked throughout the podcast the three pillars as far as balancing goes, with the feedback from the quantitative data, the frustration, pro feedback. Somebody's got to actually make this happen, okay? So back joining us now is JB. We mentioned he was on earlier. That's the lead game designer. Joining him is Kit, who is a game designer here in Barcelona. And why don't we just start now with the Jackal rework? You guys okay with that? And
Yeah,
maybe
absolutely.
explain to us, we can show the video now, explain to us what is going on with Jackal as far as the rework. Are you okay with that?
Yeah.
And then, we'll take it from there.
So most of the problems have already been outlined by different people, but this is just clearly showing you what the rework is.
Okay.
So right now, what will happen when you look at a footprint, you will select a specific footprint that you want to scan. This is because now the color and the age of the footprint has a significant impact on the gameplay result. So each different footprint will have a different number of pings you get for it. So that means that as Jackal, I have a choice about whether I actually use my scan or not. So you turn your Inox on, you look at it, you see it's blue, and you think, okay, well, I'm only going to get 2 pings, one on the initial and then one extra. Is that information valuable for my whole team, or should I follow? Should I be a tracker? Should I continue chasing down this defender? And as you can see here, we're starting to scan, and now it's a blue footprint, so you have 2 scans, one there and the next one. And as you saw, all the footprints disappeared from that scan, so they start again at the first scan. So as Jackal, if you decide to use that resource of the footprints, you've used it up. It no longer exists anymore, and it's trying to improve the cost benefit, the risk reward balance of Jackal, which is a similar thing we did with Lion. We tried to pull the reward into line with the risk, and so hoping that this will improve the experience for all sides.
One of the things I heard you guys mention as we were talking about this rework throughout the week that really stuck with me was you felt like Jackal doesn't counter a player or an operator, he counters a play style.
Exactly. That was one of the things that Laney came with from the frustration survey. We had our own internal visions of what the problem was with Jackal, and that happens all the time. We play ranked a lot, we're engaged in the game, so we come with our own opinions, and that can be problematic sometimes because opinions aren't perfect. So we come with our opinions, and then Laney puts them into perspective with the frustration survey, and she actually came back and said that most people feel that it counters roaming, full stop. And that was something that we kind of understood, but that's the role of Jackal. But actually it was a frustration that he countered roaming because it was a hard counter. And so with this, we're aiming to give the roamers an ability to better roam and feel more comfortable, but also we're giving the anchors the ability to go and get hatches. We're giving the anchors the chance to go and get a hatch, go back down onto site, and if Jackal decides to look at a hatch, he can think, oh, maybe this is a roamer, and actually this is going to be useful, and I can go and get them. Or it's blue, so I'm only going to get 2. So maybe if I use one of my 3 charges, actually it's an anchor, and I'm not going to get much intel. And so there's this better reward, and that came from a combination of like our personal opinions, but actually very backed up by the data that we got from the Montreal.
And that adds risk as well, right? Because
Exactly.
because that person is going to know roughly where you are because of the change in time.
Exactly. That's a really important part of why a roamer has more like levers to play around this, because if as a roamer you get marked by Jackal and you get these 5 ticks, well, you know, Jackal is very, very, very close. Like, we had no information on that before, and now you have this fairly clear information. You can still get killed, there can still be 3 attackers closing in on you for sure, but it's harder for attackers to get the same results.
This was one of the big things as well when we started working on it was, as a defender, you have no intel about Jackal. Jackal could be 1 meter away from you, or he could be 30 meters away from you. You don't really know. And now with this, we're going to give the defenders that intel. You're gonna know that he's got 5 pings on you, and that's gonna improve things. So you have a better way to respond in some ways.
5 pings means you can probably smell him. He's
Yeah.
close.
And 5 pings means maybe you turn around and shoot pre-fire angles, these kind of things. So yeah.
It puts more risk on the Jackal, because if I think about how I used to play Jackal in the past, if I see red footprints, I'm on high alert, because I'm thinking like if I now bend down and start scanning this, I'm putting myself more at risk than if it's just, oh, they're just green, they're just blue, it's fine, and I can just scan them over and over again. So now if you want to get the most out of the gadget, you have to take that risk.
And I think reiterating on that point, the fact that the footprints disappear when you scan is a big deal, is a big change to Jackal. You can't just scan a blue footprint and then like follow the footprints and scan it again. You really have to be active to achieve the double scan on one character, one operator, one player. Like before, you could kind of scan it and then wait around that area and then scan it again and just spam someone and annoy someone in defense. That frustration for the defender, where they're being really quite oppressed, should be very limited now. So we're going to test this on the test server. It won't be going live after the test server, but we're aiming to have it soon.
There's a hidden nerf in there as well that I don't believe was in the patch notes, but you as a Jackal will no longer be able to scan footprints through a floor from below to up?
It was actually in the
Yeah,
patch
it's in
notes.
there.
Oh, okay, okay.
But yeah, no, that was one of the things that we leveraged when we play sessions, but we realized that it would be better if we could remove that. So it was one of those small things. When we go through the rework process, we define the problem to solve. We went through this a little bit with you guys in defining the problem to solve, brainstorming different solutions to that idea, challenging each solution, and then during that challenging process, we normally kind of cut or mark as secondary. And that was one of those things that we kind of marked as a secondary gain. It's not specific problem, but if we can include it during our production pipeline, then sure, let's do it. Because often when making stuff, if you try and do too many small things, it's very difficult to get all those small things finished. So we much prefer to kind of have specific time, balancing sprint for the small stuff. And then in Barcelona, we have a continuous production schedule for all of our big reworks that are going on and stuff that is going to be a bit more months rather than days or weeks. So yeah, that's marked as a secondary rather than just someone doing it. We put it in there with the rework.
I have one last sort of point about Jackal before maybe we get a little bit more into the process and we can bring you a bit more into the conversation. I think certainly from my personal experience, and maybe you guys can weigh in on that as well, when I used to play Jackal, there is a risk of turning on the visor, right? So when you have that on, if you get shot at, or if you get electrocuted, or maybe even there's a mute jammer in the way, it affects you. So I think the way certainly I used to play Jackal, and the way probably most players did, was to use the visor just for scanning and actually not use the secondary ability, which is not to be sort of dismissed really, the effect that you can see someone's footprints, you can see exactly where someone has moved along, and you can judge by the color how long it's been since they were there. And I think the great thing that this change does is it gives you the choice. Yes. Because now it's not just whip it on, scan, turn it off again. Now there is, because they disappear, and you have that choice to make. Do I want to follow them a bit more, or do I want to leave that? I think you use that second option
an
more.
active part in the idea behind this. We were all thinking about it, and the fantasy of Jackal fits very well into Rainbow. The fantasy of tracking someone and these things, like knowing location is such an important part of the game. Like that intel is so powerful that what we had at the moment, or in live, what we have is turn it on, scan, turn it off.
Exactly.
And if we can have turn it on, follow, it's
closer to what the original intention was.
Closer to the intention.
I worked on the original Jackal, so I can talk about the
perfect.
intention. You're absolutely right. It's one of the aspects that I like the most about this change. It brings it much closer to what we had in mind when we worked on him with Leroy. Like, we really like this fantasy and totally feel like it belongs to the Rainbow Six world. But right now, just turn it on and get these pings. It's not how it was meant to be played. So hopefully it will get closer to that.
Yeah, and if not, I suppose there's more levels you can pull. You can make it less risky to have the Inox on if someone shoots at you, or if there's other things and that can.
The levers is an important thing to bring up, because while doing production of new operators and while doing production of reworks, we're constantly thinking of what we call levers, things that we can point at, change a number or change a value, and that will allow us to tweak it, because as you mentioned, Pete, it's an iterative process. It's not something that you fix an operator, and it's not even often nerfing or buffing. It's changing, it's iterating upon, improving, and those are important things to consider.
You've seen it during the sprint this week. Like, we've evaluated tons of different things that we wanted to do, and you've also seen that we had a bunch of bad surprises where we felt like, okay, this is probably easy to change. And actually, when we start digging, we see that actually it's not.
Yeah.
And when it's not, it's because it was not meant to be a lever from the get-go. We have a lot of legacy issues in Rainbow, a lot of things that are a bit old and need some refreshment. And typically, when we can identify the levers like early in development, it means that everything has been thought for it to be easy to change. And when it's done that way, then it's a lot easier for us to be reactive and to just say, hey, we have everything we need to be sure that this is what we want. Now we can just do it. And very often it's not the case. So we're progressing, as months go by, we're progressing on this.
That speaks to the collaboration between Barcelona and Montreal and the way it's improving over the cell structure. So now that we have the cells balancing, we're here in Barcelona, we're focused on our one goal. But that doesn't mean that we don't need to talk to the operator cells in Montreal. And we've had a very good collaboration, which is improving each season with working out what levers we want. So they will be working on operators, and it's now part of the pipeline that they think of a lever that will allow us to change it when it needs to be 2 seasons, 3 seasons, a year later. But we've also been involved more with the operator cells to collaborate and say, we see a question here, and we've got that opportunity now to kind of bring up questions, but also to anticipate the future, and that's improving dramatically over the last year that we've been active as a balancing cell and as a focused team on this. It's improved the whole kind of ecosystem of Rainbow.
Yes.
Which is pretty
I think we can even give a specific example from something that we saw this week. We talked earlier about Legion and the sort of change you proposed. If I can repaint that target
absolutely.
on your back.
That's a perfect example. It's already out there.
And yeah, so the idea was, hey, so what if Legion doesn't do immediate impact damage when you step into it? And it sounds so easy, and within minutes almost, we were able to test that, and it worked perfectly. There is, though, the one problem that whenever a Legion mine, a Goo mine, does damage to you, you have a little bit of a blood splatter that goes onto your screen, right? And that's hard-coded in. You can't turn that off.
Well, we can turn it off.
Well,
it
but
will
not as quickly.
require not a sprint.
Exactly. So that
yeah.
is exactly the reason why this change isn't going in immediately with the next patch, is because there is this sort of, it would cause confusion,
Yes.
right?
Exactly.
Because you have blood always means damage,
Yeah.
and in this case you would get a blood splatter without damage.
That's the perfect example to use to as well show how we're lifting the curtain a bit for you guys to see how game development is and the challenges that we're overcoming, because certain things sound great, sound easy, but actually you have to think about more than just the gameplay, because we played a play session with it and the gameplay was good and we were happy with the gameplay, but game development isn't just gameplay and game design, because there's also the user experience design, which is within the game design kind of category. But the user experience for Legion would say you have blood splatter, that triggers the logic in my mind that I've been damaged, but I haven't.
And that's how it felt. Like, this is exact feedback I gave at the end of the session. Was like, okay, it works functionally, but I don't know why. I still feel like when I walk on it, I still feel like I get damaged.
And it's the sound as well, I think,
yeah.
plays into it.
So there's all of these extra layers, which is why, again, it's important that we have this cell structure now, because within our team we have game design, we have code, we have audio, we have animation. I work in the realization and the art side, and we have all of these different elements so that any change can be checked, so that we're not just changing gameplay.
And it's something that as a regular player, it doesn't really occur to you that much, but one of the play sessions we did yesterday, I really highlighted that. We tested a gadget that felt dangerous. It felt so oppressive. It had an explosion in there and you just thought, oh, this is really dangerous. I don't want to go anywhere near it. And then when we started talking about it later, we started realizing, well, actually, the effect maybe wouldn't have been as much as the feedback suggested, which was eye-opening for me, because for me, normally, it's something that I suppose I absorb subconsciously, but don't really think about and how it affects the player.
If you don't have to think about it, it means we did our job well.
And on top of that, that's an example where actually part of the reason that pro players seem to lead the use of gadgets is because they kind of see the matrix a bit and they really see the gameplay impact. They kind of, the feeling and the psychology that the majority of our player base go on instinct and psychology and kind of these things. The pro players are a bit more like focused, and if something does no damage, they'll run through it. It's much more of a cost-benefit analysis that they have done. They have researched, they understand better. And so that's an example of why sometimes they lead the charge with using new operators that the rest of us are kind of hesitant or don't understand fully. And that's where we need to make the UX better or make the experience communicate to the player what is happening.
Can you? I'm going to put you on the spot here, and just tell me if you don't want to answer this question. But can you give the viewers an example of something crazy you guys have worked on and actually progressed a couple of levels before it got shut down? Maybe it was with the Jackal rework. Was there some wild idea that you actually tried out a couple of times, and then ended up getting shut down?
Specifically on Jackal, I can't think of anything wild, but we did go through numerous iterations. This isn't the first version. This isn't the first idea. We've actually worked on this since kind of early summer, so this has been going on for a while, and different iterations and refinement and new user experience. That's an example where we made the rework and we were like, yeah, we like this. This is cool. But then we had a call to check everything from all the different perspectives, and user experience was like, well, we need to make this clearer. This needs to be better. We also need to take into consideration colorblind players and the way that they will get impacted by this change. And so that was an example. It's not crazy, and it wasn't shut down, but it definitely kind of took us, and we took a moment, and we go, okay, we need to go a bit to the side and continue working, and maybe like iterate on a couple of different ideas and a different thing. So crazy things, I'm trying
Not
to
on
think.
Jackal. What else did we have? Seen as crazy. Trying to think.
I'm sorry, I'm putting you on the spot. I know
it's
that
an
you guys
interesting
have
question.
seen some stuff. You guys have seen some things.
No, I remember one that was pretty cool that we can talk about because it was a fun idea. Do you remember the electric grenade?
Oh, I love that thing.
It was really fun. That was really fun.
I'm intrigued. Electric grenade.
So before the balancing, in Barcelona we had a few different kind of groups, and one of the groups was working on secondary gadgets, and they'd been working on them since around launch of the game.
Even a bit before, because the
yeah.
Claymore and Impacts were already in development at that time.
Okay, so yeah, in Barcelona we've been working on this game for a long time. But secondary gadgets, there's a few different reasons why we may introduce new ones. Fresh new gameplay, alternatives to existing operators,
Balancing lever.
and then a balancing lever. Because right now, if we want to change an operator and they have two mediocre secondaries and we need to make them a little bit worse, it's difficult. Or if we have an operator who we need to make a bit better, but they already have C4 and impacts, it's like, well, it's difficult to up the ante from there.
Mm-mm.
So yeah, we were working on these things, and electricity grenade, essentially area denial for defense.
Yeah, it was really fun because it has this bouncing behavior on walls.
Yeah, it bounced off, and then when it landed on the floor, it would kind of, I guess, gameplay terms would be similar to having a throwable electrified barbed wire that
Something like that.
would disintegrate after a while.
Interesting.
It was slowing you down, destroying gadgets.
Yeah.
It was quite crazy. It was super powerful.
That thing that would be appearing on the
It was-
frustration
it was-
survey.
Really,
Potentially.
really fun to play on basement laundry
Yeah.
and just deny the plant from behind a mirror. You're
In
just,
Oregon.
Yeah, in Oregon.
Yeah,
Yeah,
it was
sorry. Yeah. laundry was a fun objective, and the funny thing is now thinking about that, like, we went through a couple of different iterations, and that site is always where it seemed just a bit too crazy. So yeah.
Well, thanks for sharing that. You guys have anything else for?
I think maybe we can talk a little bit more about sort of the process and how Montreal and
Sure.
Barcelona collaborate, because we did the sprint this week, or a truncated version of that, and then also like anything that doesn't fit into the sprint goes into the balancing roadmap and then becomes a longer thing.
Yeah.
So there's always, I think, like a circular loop between you. Like you have the direction coming from Montreal in terms of this is what we've identified, then the ideas being generated here in collaboration really, and then once those prototypes come out, then it goes back to the play sessions and also back for feedback in Montreal.
Yeah, I think something that was mentioned earlier that may have confused a bit the relationship is the way we work is that direction comes from Montreal. The user research stuff also gives a lot of direction, and once we're given the direction, it is now kind of our thing, and we spend all day, every day thinking about that thing. We then come to Skype calls with Montreal, and we propose or we suggest what we think could be an interesting thing, and they give us our critique on it. So it's kind of like a feedback loop where we suggest something, they critique it, we go back, do some more, and critique it. So all of the production, all of the development, all of the changes pretty much happen here. But the aid that Montreal give us is in critique, is in play sessions, because we are playing the thing that we're working on, which means we're comfortable with it. Glass is an example of that. We got really comfortable using Glass's sniper without the banana vision. And so that meant that we worked on it, and Montreal critiqued it because they hadn't experienced it, and they said, this isn't that comfortable. So we made it a bit more comfortable, and there's maybe some more work to do there, but that was an example where we're on the ground all day, every day, and then we send these balancing changes and get these guys to suggest or to critique or have play sessions with pros and all these other things that help us to continue working on it. So it's, as you said, cyclical and cyclical feedback loop.
Excellent.
Anything else for you guys?
Yeah, that's it.
Thank you guys, and we'll start to wrap it up here. But thanks so much. It's been nice sitting down
Thank
with
you
you.
for having us.
Yeah,
Cheers, fellas.
Wow.
Yeah. That's just an overview of what we've been doing a week.
It's been a crazy week, man.
It has been.
It's been awesome. Once in a lifetime experience. I've learned a lot.
It's going to inform how we make content and how we talk about patch notes and look at designer notes. Give us an understanding of what's going on and the passion and the work.
Yeah, absolutely. You think about it, like one of the main drivers of balancing right now is what is frustrating players, all of the players, not just the pro players, not just regular players, everyone. What is making the game less fun to play? And that, I think, is such a valuable thing to look at apart from just performance. But that, for us as content creators or the entire community, was not something any of us knew about. And it's been going on for a while. Like, this isn't something that started 2 months ago. This has been going on for season after season already. And I suppose to a degree we saw the shift. We kind of maybe felt the shift in the changes that were coming. Like, it didn't feel as if, in more recent seasons, as if everything was being driven by the balancing matrix. Like, I think we kind of picked up on that. I think I remember discussions that we've had on the podcast in the past, but it's really good to see this additional information going in. So yeah, it's been really fascinating to see that, and like, I fully agree with you, it's going to change how we talk about this in future, and hopefully also how everyone at home understands the changes that go in future.
Yeah, I remember a time, maybe on the podcast, or like you're looking at Blitz and be like, man, they're never going to nerf him. He's way down there on the win delta. There's no way, because I didn't know, obviously, this was a whole other aspect of balance. And then, a patch note comes out, and I'm like, ooh, they nerfed Blitz. I like it, And so, like you said, it's been going on, and we've kind of had a sense of something's changed. But now we got to peek back behind the curtain, and it's been great.
I remember your Blitz video when you did the little test. I don't think you were at home, and remember the...
the ADS speed.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yep.
I remember having that conversation with you at the time.
Yeah, it's been a really good week. And, I think at this time, I really want to give a shout out to, obviously, all of the staff here that's with us from Montreal, but especially the staff here at the Barcelona studio. Every single person that I've met has been a passionate Rainbow Six Siege fan. We mentioned earlier, they're always playing it. From the game designers, the programmers, the people who work on cosmetics, you should see the way that their eyes light up when you start to talk to them about your favorite things in the game. And it's been an amazing experience to see the people behind the game that we love. That's probably, the balancing part has been awesome, but the thing that I'll probably take with me the most is the people behind the game. It's been truly incredible.
Yep. Thanks to everyone at Ubisoft Barcelona for making this a really incredible experience.
And it's not just the insight, like it's not just we're here to talk about it and show it off. That's one aspect.
Yep.
But one thing I really appreciated was that we were part of it.
Yeah.
We got to do the playtests, we got to give feedback like everyone else. We got to contribute ideas that were immediately implemented.
Well, not mine. Like,
If there's anything bad, it was probably Pete's. But joking aside, like that for me was also great fun. It kind of brought me back to the sort of technology consultant days back when I used to work in that, and just coming in, working on the client side in a project that's it was exciting. It was really good fun.
I think as a final thing before we go today, just to say we talked about a number of balance changes, whether that be Legion, Twitch, Glaz. None of that is definite.
We don't know what's in the
We
patch
don't know,
notes,
yeah.
so, yeah.
These are just things that they iterated on and let us try out, and we fed back to them. So I don't want to break any hearts or get anyone's hopes up, so just bear that in mind.
Good point.
And I think one last point to mention really as well is we've been live on the Rainbow Six channel, and I think even on Twitter. So if you're new, if you don't know us, if you've enjoyed the conversation that we've had, we do this podcast. We've been doing it for over a year, and we do this every week pretty much as long as we can manage. It's usually Monday evenings, 8 p.m. UK time, 3 p.m. Eastern. So you can always join us live for the streams then, or of course the video on demands go up on YouTube if you want to watch, or it's a podcast. So if you go to literally any good podcasting app, you put in Hot Breach Podcast, 3 words, you will be able to find this, and you can listen to us wherever you go. It's usually the 3 of us, definitely, but we've had all kinds of guests on. We bring developers on as guests. We bring on Parker's a great guest. He's been so many times. Pro players. Fabian was an amazing guest to have on. If you've not seen that episode, that's worth going back for. So yeah, the point I want to make is if you've enjoyed this, if you want to see more of this in future, feel free to search for us. You'll find us for sure.
Thanks everybody for inviting us and making this possible. Thanks for everybody for watching. Hopefully we've been able to shed some light on balancing in Rainbow Six Siege. And with that, Hot Breach Podcast is going to sign off. See ya.
See you again soon.